Hey guys, tonight we're heading into the soft shadows of Colombia's 1980s, a decade thick with heat, rumbling engines, and quiet men who held the loudest power. We're not chasing gunfire tonight. No, we're stepping into polished offices, dim ranch kitchens, and the still spaces between two glances that mean everything. Jorge Luis Ochoa isn't the loud one in the room. He's the one who owns the room and leaves before you know who he is. He doesn't need to shout. The phone rings on his behalf. The money moves on its own. Picture a clean white shirt, pressed perfectly, with not a wrinkle out of place. A cattleman's hat hanging neatly on a brass hook, and a soft smile that says, "Don't worry, everything is handled." While the world burns just outside the door, you probably won't survive this story. Not because of bullets, but because you'll find out how quiet control feels more dangerous than rage. It doesn't bang on the door. It builds the house around you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Always curious who's staying up with me. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Jorge Luis Ochoa's story doesn't start in smoke or screams. It begins with cattle. The ranch is wide. Dust rolls in lazy spirals. Horses flick their tails beside low fences. Somewhere not far, a truck rumbles as it's loaded with crates, legal ones for now. And inside the office of that sleepy ranch, Jorge stares at a spreadsheet. This isn't the ledger of a drug empire, not yet. These are prices for cattle feed, labor costs, the fuel it takes to move 36 bulls to Bogota by dawn. His brow is furrowed, not in worry, but calculation. Numbers are language to Jorge. He's fluent. Outside the window, a young ranch hand wipes sweat from his neck, unaware that the man inside will one day be worth more than the gross domestic product of a small country. Jorge doesn't look like danger. His smile is soft, lips barely curved, always polite. There's something grandfatherly about him, even when he's young. But it's the kind of grandfather who has 3 safe deposit boxes in 3 cities and can disappear without a trace if things get ugly. The 1980s are about to change everything, but here in this moment, he's just a businessman. That's how it begins, with business. That's how it always begins. Many people still think that the Medellín Cartel rose from chaos and bloodshed, like a flower blooming in gunpowder. But really, it started in quiet places. Offices, cafes, gentlemen's clubs where the napkins were starched and the whiskey came neat. So what do you think? Could a drug empire really begin with someone just trying to move beef more efficiently? In Jorge's case, yes. He was raised in cattle, in paperwork, in traditions older than asphalt. The Ochoa family had been in the ranching business for generations. Land was their inheritance, and cattle was their song. But Jorge had something else. He had the math, the eye for detail. He could look at a trade agreement and spot the advantage before the ink dried. He wasn't flashy, not like Pablo would be. He didn't believe in bodyguards with Uzis or silver-plated pistols. He believed in invoices, and those, too, could kill. By the time he was 30, Jorge had already earned a reputation in the business circles of Medellín, not as a criminal, but as a sharp entrepreneur, one who smiled more than he spoke. His cattle company was doing well, moving stock all over Colombia and even to Venezuela. Everything looked legitimate, because most of it was. That was Jorge's magic trick. Hide the wolves in sheep's clothing. Or in this case, bulls. Do you remember the day he left with the first money? It wasn't in a duffel bag. It was in a briefcase, leather-bound, with contracts folded neatly inside. The bribe money was labeled consulting fees. The smuggling network listed as logistics expansion. Jorge wasn't hiding. He was blending. And nobody blends like a man who looks like your accountant but bankrolls your nightmares. He met men with mustaches and perfect teeth, shook hands across marble desks, and sealed deals with a pen worth more than your car. He didn't have to intimidate. He just waited. Everyone came to him eventually. One day, a man approached him at a livestock auction. Not a rancher. Too clean. The handshake too firm, too practiced. He complimented Jorge's tie. Then he asked if Jorge could move something slightly different. Nothing big, just a crate. Fast, quiet. Jorge didn't answer right away. He finished his coffee. Then he asked, "Where to?" And that's where the real business began. The first shipment wasn't cocaine. It was cash. Crisp bills returning from Miami and hollowed-out generator parts. The trick wasn't smuggling the product. The trick was getting the profits back without anyone noticing. And Jorge, well, he loved solving puzzles like that. He started drawing maps, not of roads or borders, but of people. Which airport staff looked the other way? Which bank managers didn't ask too many questions? Which customs officials had children at expensive schools? He didn't just build routes. He built people networks. And those are harder to trace. Mainstream historians often focus on Pablo Escobar, his flair, his brutality. But many miss the keystone behind the cartel's structure. Jorge's math, his logic, his cold, spreadsheet serenity. By 1981, his cattle company had 3 new divisions. None had offices. All had mailing addresses in Panama. And still, he smiled. Neighbors described him as charming, quiet, a gentleman. He hosted fundraisers for local schools, donated land to church groups. If he passed you on the street, you'd never know he was part of a billion-dollar narcotics syndicate. That's how the most dangerous ones do it. Not with noise, but with nods. He'd later say, privately, that he never considered himself a drug trafficker, just a businessman who diversified. But behind that smile, a small empire was humming to life. One truck at a time, one bribe at a time. One hand quietly pressed into another beneath a linen tablecloth. And in the heat of that Colombian dusk, Jorge Luis Ochoa sits in his office again, a fresh ledger before him, cattle prices on the left, something else on the right, and a small corner note, just numbers, no names. He smiles. The Ochoa ranch stretches like an old memory, wide, sun-baked, and worn with the weight of time. Dust settles on wooden beams, cracked leather saddles, and hooves that echo with the slow rhythm of certainty. This is where Jorge learns loyalty, not from lessons, but from animals and men who keep their word without speaking. You tie a bull properly, it doesn't stray. You pay a ranch hand fairly, he doesn't talk. Long before the spreadsheets and secret accounts, before the meetings with men in mirrored sunglasses and opaque motivations, Jorge Luis Ochoa is just a boy in boots too large, walking the fields behind his father. He watches how cattle are bought, sold, transported. He listens to how debts are settled, how hands are shaken with weight and intention. He learns early that silence isn't awkward, it's powerful. His father, Fabio Ochoa Restrepo, is a name of weight in Medellín. Not infamous, not yet. Respected, though. A gentleman rancher who also has a finger in racehorses, motorcycles, and politics. The Ochoa patriarch isn't a violent man, but he knows when to step back from a conversation and let silence finish the sentence. Jorge watches and learns. Many people still think that Jorge stumbled into drug trafficking, nudged along by wilder partners. But so, what do you think? Could a boy raised among bull breeders and bank meetings really not notice the shape of power growing beneath his boots? He attends private schools, wears ironed uniforms, learns to say please and thank you with surgical precision. He excels, not loudly, but exactly. Teachers remember him as pleasant, sharp, and a bit unreadable. He smiles when corrected. He nods often. He gives nothing away. At home, the dinner table hums with quiet authority. Conversations aren't shouted, they're measured. There are servants, yes, but more importantly, there is order. When his father speaks, it's less about volume and more about timing. His mother, Doña Alicia, sips her coffee without ever letting the spoon clink against the china. That's the kind of precision Jorge learns. By the time he's a teenager, Jorge's already fluent in adult silences. He can stand in a room with men twice his age and know when to speak, and when to listen so quietly the others forget he's there. The Ochoa boys, Jorge, Fabio Jr., and Juan David, are close, but Jorge is always the calm one. Fabio Jr. is more reactive, more openly ambitious. Juan David has a sharp tongue and quick fists. But Jorge moves like fog over still water, present but ungraspable. On weekends, the brothers ride horses through the hills, accompanied by bodyguards who pretend to be just employees. At night, they play poker with local officials' sons. And somewhere in all that privilege, Jorge learns the most important lesson. Being rich is useful, but being respectable? That's how you make the rich come to you. He heads off to school in the United States for a while, briefly, discreetly. There, he picks up American manners, learns how to hold a martini without spilling it, and files away the taste of ambition under a steel lid. He doesn't stay long. There's no reason to. He's not chasing an education. He's memorizing mannerisms. Back home, he folds into the Medellín elite like a suit that fits too well. He becomes a fixture in upscale events, not the center of attention, but always nearby. The guy you shake hands with when you want something done quietly. Historical fact. By the late 1970s, Medellín wasn't just a city anymore. It was becoming a nerve center. The world's appetite for cocaine was ballooning, and Colombia, with its geography and corruption-friendly corridors, was perfectly positioned. But that transformation didn't happen overnight or in slums. It began in quiet offices and luxury ranches like Jorge's, and so the invitations start coming in. Not directly, not at first. A cousin of a cousin, a friend of a friend. Hey Jorge, can you help with something? Small, just logistics. And he always does. Smoothly, no complaints. He arranges transport, signs paperwork, finds the right customs officer. No guns, just ink and timing. He's not involved, not really. He's just helping a friend move some supplies. His father remains clean, or at least never named. Don Fabio is still the gentleman, but his sons, especially Jorge, are beginning to move in quieter, deeper waters. And Don Fabio knows better than to ask too many questions. There's a family gathering, sometime around 1978, a birthday or a baptism. Jorge stands near the back patio, a whiskey in hand, talking to a man in a suit that doesn't quite fit. The man's nervous, checking over his shoulder every few seconds. Jorge stays calm, listens, nods once. And just like that, a new route is opened through Panama. Do you remember the first shipment? It wasn't glamorous. No flashing lights. Just a refrigerated truck with some prime beef on the manifest. Inside, hidden within the walls, bundles of tightly packed powder sealed in wax and plastic. It crossed 2 borders. Nobody looked twice. Afterward, the man in the ill-fitting suit hands Jorge a briefcase. No celebration, just a handshake. From that point forward, Jorge stops attending some of the ranch meetings. He delegates. His focus shifts to a new kind of livestock, one that doesn't moo, but does multiply quickly under the right light. Back at the ranch, no one suspects anything. Jorge still attends Mass, still shakes hands with the mayor, still gives to local charities. But in the evenings, his phone rings a little more often, and when it does, he speaks softly, then hangs up with a nod. He begins expanding the ranch's infrastructure. More trucks, more staff, more accounting departments, all legal, all documented. But if you looked closely at the timing, you'd see something strange. The surge of investment always comes a few weeks after a major bust in the U.S. Cocaine gets confiscated. Prices spike. Jorge? He buys another truck fleet. Coincidence? Maybe. But people in Medellín start to notice. There's a story told quietly, years later, about a night Jorge drove himself through the hills. No guards, no backup, just him and a briefcase. He met someone in a village square, a man who would later become a minister, and handed him the case. Nobody knows what was in it. The next month, an airstrip opened near one of Jorge's smaller properties. You do the math. That's how Jorge builds trust, not with threats, but with usefulness. He becomes the man who always has a solution. You need to move a shipment? Jorge knows a guy. You need a clean bank account in Curacao? Jorge can make a call. You need a quiet favor that never appears on paper? Jorge smiles, and so begins the real machinery. Not bullets, not street wars, but elegant, quiet wheels clicking into place, one ledger at a time. The air in Medellín feels different when money moves. It's not the kind of shift you can see. It's something in the quiet, in the way people cross streets faster, or how the cafe staff suddenly know your name and your preferred table without ever asking. Jorge Luis Ochoa, Medellín's quietest entrepreneur, starts taking his coffee in nicer establishments. Crisp shirts, gold cufflinks, a car that never parks longer than 15 minutes. His cattle empire still operates, of course, but it now shares space with something far more lucrative and far less visible. The cattle trucks continue to roll, but now with double floors, secret compartments, and schedules that don't always align with the meatpacking plant's needs. Jorge calls these overlapping interests. He's good at those. Two truths can exist at once: a legal business and a criminal enterprise, especially when the one camouflages the other. He begins building a front that's so polished, so professionally bland, it becomes its own kind of armor. And that's how the Medellín Cartel found its most legitimate face. While Pablo Escobar was still making headlines for blowing up planes and issuing threats on cassette tapes, Jorge was refining his image. His polo club membership remained pristine. His staff always polite. His taxes filed early. Overpaid even. People forget that the Medellín Cartel wasn't just a gang, it was a corporation, with departments, with divisions. And Jorge was its CFO in all but title. He didn't invent the routes, but he did make them efficient. He didn't plant the coca, but he monetized its journey better than anyone. There was no room for chaos in his model. That was Escobar's domain. Jorge kept the wires untangled. Mainstream historical fact. In the early 1980s, the cartel was handling more than 80% of the world's cocaine supply. And yet, for years, Jorge managed to avoid the kind of media spotlight that scorched his louder peers. Many people still think that's because he played a smaller role. But so what do you think? Could the man signing off on multi-million-dollar airlifts really be a minor player? Jorge's name started appearing in whispers, not headlines. Bankers knew it. Politicians knew it. Even bishops knew it. But they didn't say it aloud because there was nothing to stick to him. Every transaction, legal. Every piece of property, purchased clean. Every alias, ironed and pressed. He once told a young associate, "The key to staying free is to make sure the money they find is too clean to confiscate." It wasn't a joke. Jorge's strength was in appearances. You'd never see him at the jungle labs. That was too dirty, too obvious. He preferred boardrooms, lounges with soft music, airports where the security staff knew his driver by name. He developed what insiders later called the polished front, a system of mirrored decency. He didn't touch the drugs. He touched the packaging, the funding, the route architecture. He turned drug shipments into commodities on a spreadsheet. X kilos per Y mile per Z bribe. Clean math for a messy world. And it worked, until the math got attention. By 1982, the United States had begun connecting dots, but not clearly. They had names: Escobar, Gotcha, later. But Jorge's name always came last, if at all. He didn't fit the profile. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't smuggle weapons. He smuggled balance sheets. Still, the DEA started noticing patterns. Certain bank accounts tied to fake companies that only seemed to operate out of post offices in Panama. They would later discover that many of those shell companies were originally registered by associates of Jorge, under cattle trade names, no less. He was using his own history as camouflage. Do you remember the time he turned down the first gun shipment? An arms broker from the United States approached the cartel with a bulk offer: automatic rifles, scopes, even grenades. Jorge sat through the entire pitch, stone-faced. At the end, he simply said, "We're not an army. We're an investment." And that was that. Even Escobar had to respect it. Jorge wasn't interested in firepower. He was interested in flow. His house in Medellín was famously modest by cartel standards. No golden toilets, no tigers, just clean lines, tasteful art, and a private office that looked like any other executive's suite. Except the safe behind the bookshelf was reportedly as big as a refrigerator. At home, Marta, his wife, kept things orderly. She liked things just so. Curtains drawn at dusk, dinners on time. She rarely spoke about business, but insiders say she was more aware than she let on. She balanced the books when needed. She made polite conversation with visiting politicians' wives, and she never, ever asked twice about late-night meetings. That was the rhythm of the Ochoa household. Smooth, professional, understated. You could almost forget that beneath it, the cocaine trade was being run like a Fortune 500 company. One of Jorge's most critical innovations was something called the split trail. Instead of shipping everything through one route and risking interception, he divided large shipments into smaller ones that used different carriers, departure times, and destinations. This decentralized model dramatically lowered loss ratios. It wasn't just smart, it was revolutionary. For every kilo lost to authorities, 5 made it through. The margin was unbeatable, and yet, he still showed up at his children's school recitals, still posed for charity galas. There's a photo from the early 80s, Jorge standing beside a bishop and a mayor, holding a ceremonial shovel at a groundbreaking for an orphanage. 2 weeks later, 3 planes left for Miami. That was the pattern. Good works and quiet shipments. A donation here, a container there. And always, the polished front. Even his enemies respected it. Rodriguez Orejuela, the older Cali brother, once reportedly said, "If we had 3 Jorges, we'd own the hemisphere." But not everyone in the cartel liked his style. Escobar called him too quiet, too slow. Jorge called Escobar too loud, too soon. It was inevitable. They were both indispensable, but moving on different frequencies. Escobar was fire. Jorge was water. And water, as it turns out, carves deeper in the long run. The first real crack in the polished front came from something small. A customs officer in Curacao noticed a cattle shipment with paperwork that didn't quite line up. It wasn't dramatic, just dates that didn't match, and a contact number that went nowhere. But it was enough. Authorities in the U.S. started looking closer, and while they didn't have Jorge's name yet, they were beginning to see his fingerprints. Still, Jorge smiled. He always smiled. In certain circles of Medellin's old money, there's a phrase used with reverence and caution. Él tiene amigos en todas las alturas. He has friends in all the high places. It's whispered about those who move too smoothly through bureaucracies, who attend weddings where the guest list includes both senators and smugglers, and whose calls get returned within a single ring, no matter the hour. Jorge Luis Ochoa doesn't just know people in power. He knows when not to ask for favors, because the favors arrive on their own. By the early 1980s, Jorge's reputation as a respectable businessman has turned into a kind of mythos. He walks into country clubs where police commissioners laugh too loudly at his jokes. He attends charity galas where ambassadors compliment his cufflinks. He never brags, never boasts, but everyone knows, or thinks they do. That's the genius of it. His power isn't loud, it's structural. He doesn't push doors open, they unlock before he arrives. Many people still think that Escobar was the true mastermind of the Medellín Cartel, the alpha and omega of its empire. But so, what do you think? Could a bomb-throwing populist really organize the dozens of financial and political deals needed to run a global narcotics network? Escobar lit the fire. Jorge read the fire code. Historical fact: during this time, Colombia was undergoing severe political turbulence. Narco money was bleeding into elections, courts, and police precincts, but the blending wasn't always violent. In many cases, it was elegant, negotiated over steak dinners and golf games. Jorge mastered this lane. He didn't own the courts. He sponsored their fundraisers. There's a documented instance, quietly buried in a police report, where a judge, facing pressure to issue an arrest warrant, instead received a donation to his alma mater. The name on the check? A foundation run by one of Jorge's ranches. Coincidence? Let's call it strategy. He begins cultivating what his associates jokingly call the rolodex. It's not just a contact list. It's a living web of lawyers, bankers, customs officials, mayors, colonels, and a few quiet priests. Each has their price, but more importantly, each has been treated well, never threatened, always respected. That's Jorge's true innovation. Bribery without bitterness. He rarely speaks directly about the business. Most of his phone calls are about arrangements, investments, or packages. If pressed, he claims plausible deniability. And for years, that's enough. No one wants to investigate the man who just built a new wing for a children's hospital. One of his most effective relationships is with a bank executive in Bogota. They meet twice a year, always during equestrian competitions. Both enjoy horses. Both understand numbers. Jorge never asks for favors. He just discusses hypothetical liquidity transfers, always in abstract terms. By dessert, new accounts are quietly opened, fees waived. This is the polished front. now extending into politics. Jorge starts making donations, small at first, then significant. Mayoral campaigns, road construction funds, disaster relief drives. He even sponsors a scholarship program for rural students, all under the banner of Ochoa Agricultural Holdings. And while those students receive their tuition, shipments of powder cross borders unnoticed. You remember the ranch auction, right? In 1983, a large cattle property near Medellín goes up for sale. Jorge buys it, naturally, but not through his name. It's purchased by a shell company managed by a lawyer who just really loves cows. On paper, it's just another land deal, but 6 months later, a new landing strip appears nearby, cleared, leveled, and used for veterinary emergencies. The locals are baffled. No one's ever seen an air ambulance arrive. Jorge never comments on it. He just smiles when asked. Meanwhile, Escobar's antics continue to steal headlines. He's funding housing projects, building soccer fields, and running for Congress. The world watches in fascination, but Jorge watches with concern. He knows Escobar's ego is a liability. Every press conference tightens the net around all of them. He tries to pull Pablo back, gently. During one tense meeting, he tells him, "When you build a palace, don't carve your name into the bricks." Escobar laughs. Jorge doesn't. Still, he keeps working the system. He's developed what some call a ghost hand. His influence appears without presence. Judges recuse themselves. Witnesses forget. Investigators reassign. And Jorge? Jorge just keeps sending out Christmas cards, signed in blue ink with a lovely embossed logo. At a fundraiser for flood victims, a governor clinks glasses with him and whispers, "You have the smoothest empire I've ever seen." Jorge replies, "What empire?" with a grin that could oil machinery, and yet he never oversteps. That's the key. For all his quiet power, he maintains plausible deniability. No overt threats, no traceable payments, just relationships nurtured over dinners and decades. At home, Marta watches the news with a glass of wine. She never flinches when Jorge's associates are arrested or named. She trusts his instincts, and when she's worried, she doesn't ask. She makes him tea instead. There's an unspoken rule between them. Say little, listen closely. One night, Jorge receives a letter, handwritten, no return address. Inside, a list of 3 names, all senators. No message, just the list. He burns it after reading, but not before memorizing every name. Within a month, all 3 publicly oppose Colombia's extradition treaty with the United States. Coincidence? Jorge's entire life is built on them. He begins traveling more, always with purpose, always under the guise of legitimate business. Panama, Venezuela, even Europe. Everywhere he goes, he leaves behind new contacts, new arrangements, new favors owed. In a Madrid hotel lounge, a Spanish banker tells him, "You don't look like a man who needs help hiding things." Jorge smiles. "That's because I don't hide. I organize, and that's the difference." Escobar builds bunkers. Jorge builds networks. Even when American intelligence begins tightening its grip, Jorge's name remains low on the list. He's not seen with weapons. He doesn't appear in cartel photos. There are no recordings of him issuing threats. What there are, however, are flight records, paper trails, bank slips with just enough ambiguity to avoid scrutiny. He knows the game. The trick is never being the signature at the bottom. Be the suggestion. Be the connection. Be the man who makes things happen quietly and leaves nothing but a thank you note. The irony? Most people who meet him don't remember his voice. They remember the handshake. Firm, dry, courteous. The kind of handshake that doesn't just close deals, it opens doors. The ranch trucks keep rolling across Colombia's spine, steel-bellied, mud-caked, and full of surprises. Some carry cattle feed, others carry neatly stacked crates labeled agricultural supplements. Inside those crates, tucked between fake invoices and blank customs forms, lie vacuum-sealed bricks of white powder. Jorge Luis Ochoa doesn't pack them. He doesn't even see them. But he knows exactly how many there are, where they're headed, and what time they'll cross the border. Because logistics, not violence, is his true art form. Crossing from cattle into cocaine doesn't happen with a bang. It happens with paperwork. It happens with margin adjustments. Jorge doesn't shift careers. He tweaks spreadsheets. The first major shipment comes through the Caribbean. Simple, quiet, and incredibly profitable. So profitable, in fact, that Jorge's ranches suddenly need fewer cattle but more refrigeration units. The balance sheets still look clean. The taxes are still paid. But the ledger margins begin to sparkle with a quiet glow no livestock has ever produced. He calls it optimization. You remember the shipping manager, don't you? His name was Orlando. Mid-40s, balding, excellent with numbers, but not with secrets. One afternoon, Orlando notices a new line item on a cargo manifest. A crate supposedly filled with veterinary equipment weighed slightly more than it should have. Curious, he asks Jorge about it. Jorge looks up from his desk, smiles, and says, "Sometimes, Orlando, things weigh more because of responsibility." Orlando never asks again. Within a year, he owns a house he never dreamed of affording and stops caring about the extra weight. That's how Jorge does it. No threats, just opportunities. No blackmail, just upgraded expectations. Mainstream historical fact. The Medellín Cartel, by the early 1980s, had developed one of the most sophisticated smuggling infrastructures in history. They used submarines, planes, trucks, even coffin liners, but many of their most effective routes started as legitimate supply chains. Jorge's ranching business wasn't just a disguise. It was the mold from which the trafficking network was cast. Many people still think Jorge was simply the money guy. But so what do you think? Could a man so fluent in supply chains really not know what moved inside his own trucks? Jorge starts formalizing the system. Each shipment has a designated handler, a person responsible not for guarding the drugs, but for knowing where to call if something goes wrong. Jorge doesn't trust guns. He trusts phones, and his phones ring a lot. He builds redundancies, backup drivers, alternate border crossings, second sets of papers. If a route fails, another activates instantly. He doesn't gamble. He calculates. One of his quieter victories is convincing a mid-tier customs official to mislabel shipping containers. The man never knows what's inside. He just reroutes inspections away from certain IDs. In exchange, his children get scholarships to a private educational foundation quietly backed by Jorge's cattle company. It's not generosity, it's architecture. Jorge starts using air routes, small planes mostly. They fly from remote strips deep in Colombia's interior to Caribbean islands, then onto Miami, Houston, or rural landing zones in Georgia. He prefers 2 pilot crews, always recruited through third parties. None of them ever meet him, but every one of them cashes checks that never bounce. One pilot later says, "I never met the man, but flying his jobs felt like flying for a government, and maybe it was, a shadow government, one run by ledgers and low voices. At home, things remain meticulously quiet. Marta notices that Jorge sleeps less. His dinners are shorter. He spends more time alone on the patio with a glass of rum and a folder of bank reports. Still, he smiles. Always. She asks once whether he's tired. He replies, "A good businessman doesn't get tired." He adjusts, and adjust he does. After a minor police shakeup in Bogotá, several of Jorge's usual routes become too risky. Instead of pushing through, he pauses all shipments for 6 weeks. It costs millions. Escobar is livid. Jorge shrugs. "You don't drive through a fire," he tells Pablo. "You wait for the wind to shift." That's the difference. Escobar believes in domination. Jorge believes in calibration. He begins investing in return corridors, routes that bring profits back into Colombia. These are often harder to manage than the drug shipments themselves. Bricks of US dollars don't cross borders as easily as they leave them. Jorge uses everything from art auctions to cattle auctions to launder the incoming flood. A well-known Medellín art dealer suddenly sees a surge in buyers interested in anonymous sculptures. Jorge's cousin just happens to be one of them. There's a joke whispered among local bankers. If a dollar enters Medellín and you can't trace it, check the Ochoa cattle barn first. He doesn't mind. In fact, Jorge embraces the image. He keeps his public profile impeccably neutral. No flamboyance, no new luxury cars. He still drives the same Mercedes, still wears the same brand of watch, still attends the same church services, but inside his office the numbers don't lie. One afternoon, his accountant shows him the month's total, net profit surpassing $30 million. Jorge nods, doesn't smile. "Split it between the roots," he says. 10% for fail-safes, 5 for donations. The rest, let it breathe. "Let it breathe?" the accountant asks. Jorge replies, "Money is like livestock. If you crowd it, it gets sick." And that's the mantra of Jorge Luis Ochoa. Everything must move in space, rhythm, and silence. Around this time, his operations begin drawing international curiosity. Not attention. Curiosity. A low-profile drug bust in the Caribbean reveals a shipping manifest with references to a Colombian cattle farm. The DEA takes note, but Jorge's name isn't on anything. A few weeks later, that cattle farm donates 20 bulls to a regional livestock show. 2 DEA officials attend. Unaware they're shaking hands with the man behind the manifest. Jorge thanks them for coming, offers them coffee, and even invites one to stay on the ranch. They decline. He watches them leave from the porch, arms crossed. "Do you remember that dog? The Labrador that kept wandering into Jorge's office during evening meetings?" He starts keeping a treat in his pocket just in case. His staff laughs. Even in the middle of an international cocaine empire, Jorge makes time for a good dog. That's how normal he appears, and that's why he lasts longer than most. Still, he senses change. The shipments are getting bigger, the stakes too. Escobar wants more volume, faster. Gotcha wants more territory, later wants more influence. Jorge wants efficiency. So he begins planning something bigger. A logistics hub. A clean zone, deep in Colombia's interior. Isolated, air accessible, and surrounded by plausible ranching activity. It'll require new contacts, new shell companies, and a new level of quiet. He sketches it out on a napkin one evening. Marta brings him coffee. She glances at the lines and asks, "Is this for cattle?" Jorge smiles. "In a way, because even now, at the heart of an empire, Jorge still sees everything in terms of animals, routes, and rhythm. And the most dangerous rhythm is the one you don't hear until it's too late. Money doesn't stack quietly forever. At some point, it echoes. And by 1983, Jorge Luis Ochoa's earnings aren't just echoing. They're roaring across borders in a tidal wave of untraceable bills. The banks can't count fast enough. Clerks start rubber stamping deposits without looking. The system itself bends, quietly, politely, just as Jorge prefers. His finance network stretches like a spider web. thin, almost invisible, yet impossibly strong. At the center sits Jorge, reading balance sheets with the same calm as a man reviewing rainfall statistics. There's nothing romantic about it. He's not moved by the fortune he's built. He's moved by its design. He begins routing cash through Miami. It starts simple. Small deposits into multiple accounts, always under shell companies. A lumber firm here, a seafood importer there. But Jorge doesn't like noise, so he avoids flash. No condos, no Lamborghinis, just movement, always clean, always just below the legal thresholds. Still, the river of dollars grows wider, and that's when he develops the dollar pipeline. Mainstream historical fact. In the early 1980s, Miami was flooded with cartel money. Entire banks, particularly smaller, independent ones, were practically laundering machines. One estimate suggested that up to $5 billion in dirty money moved through South Florida each year. Jorge was among the first to treat that flow like a regulated utility. He hires a small team of advisors, bankers, accountants, former customs officials, all paid generously and kept compartmentalized. No one knows the full picture. Only Jorge. Only the spreadsheet in his private safe. He starts using compaction runs, large amounts of cash vacuum-sealed, boxed in electronics or machine parts, and flown out of Miami in legal shipments. Once they land in Colombia, the funds are distributed through rural development projects, horse auctions, and even church restoration efforts. Many people still think the cartel money came back in duffel bags. But so what do you think? Could someone like Jorge really trust a teenager with a backpack more than a licensed import company with a customs lawyer on retainer? He doesn't move like a criminal. He moves like a hedge fund. And just like any good hedge fund, he diversifies. Soon, money isn't just being washed in Miami. It's cycling through Panama, Curacao, Aruba. Wherever there's a bank with soft regulations and a tired auditor, Jorge has a line in. One story stands out. A mid-level manager at a Caribbean bank notices unusual transactions. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, a foundation registered to an agricultural school in Medellín receives a 5-figure deposit, harmless on its own. But when the man flags it for review, he receives a call 2 days later from the Minister of Commerce. The flag is dropped. The bank is never questioned again. Coincidence? Of course not. Just another stitch in Jorge's flawless tapestry. Back in Medellín, things are escalating. Escobar is now openly battling the state. Newspaper offices bombed, police assassinated. Jorge, meanwhile, tries to keep the business quiet, clean. But it's getting harder. His name begins surfacing in confidential memos. American agencies start building profiles, yet his public persona remains untouched. At charity functions, he's introduced as Señor Ochoa, cattle magnate. He smiles, shakes hands, avoids cameras. Always the gentleman. He invests heavily in his ranches now, not to expand cattle operations, but to diversify the laundering infrastructure. One property adds a dairy operation that never actually produces milk. Another ranch, ostensibly focused on horse breeding, becomes a key logistics stop for incoming cash shipments. Even Marta starts noticing. She walks into his office one morning and sees 7 leather briefcases lined up on the floor. Too many suitcases for just cattle, she says gently. Jorge doesn't answer. He just closes his ledger. Later that night, she asks if they're safe. As long as we stay predictable, he replies. Predictable. That's the cornerstone of Jorge's entire empire. He doesn't like surprises, so he builds in buffers. If a truck fails to arrive, he doesn't panic. He checks which replacement route is already active. If a banker dies unexpectedly, he already has another vetted by an old acquaintance. The system is redundant, robust, quiet. Do you remember the Miami accountant? His name was Leonard, pale, bespectacled, obsessed with coffee and decimal precision. Jorge never met him in person, but through intermediaries, Leonard became a key node in the dollar pipeline. One year, Leonard's firm is audited. A young agent asks about a client file that lists Jorge's cattle company. Leonard shrugs, says, "I think it's an import-export account. Nothing big." He's not lying. That's what the documents say. 2 months later, Leonard retires, early in Greece. The flow of money doesn't just continue, it increases. Jorge begins handling outside business now, routes and laundering for partners in other parts of the hemisphere. Not everyone trusts Escobar, especially with his flair for attracting heat. But Jorge is like Swiss neutrality. He doesn't fight. He balances. He's paid handsomely for this. Soon, his personal fortune is in the hundreds of millions. Yet his house remains modest. His suits, tailored but not flashy. He prefers quiet restaurants, familiar waitstaff, back tables. There's a story from this era. Jorge attends a horse auction. A senator is also present. They chat, briefly, about saddle breeds and export regulations. The next week, that senator blocks a piece of legislation aimed at seizing cartel assets. No deal was ever made, but 2 months later, that senator's re-election campaign receives a generous donation from an agricultural lobby no one's ever heard of. Coincidence? You already know the answer. Jorge's grip on the system is now so complete, he doesn't have to hide. He simply disperses. His name is never at the center. He exists in whispers, in shared glances, in the quiet nods between powerful men who owe him more than they care to admit. And still, he's not afraid, because Jorge knows the true threat isn't being seen, it's being understood. And no one, not even Escobar, truly understands how deep his web runs. Medellín is changing, and not for the better. The air tastes sharper. Sirens grow more frequent. Street corners once guarded by bored policemen now buzz with undercover agents and whispered warnings. Journalists lean a little harder into their stories. Government ministers start sweating under soft lights during interviews. The quiet corridors Jorge Luis Ochoa once strolled through unbothered are now lined with tension, with suspicion, and somewhere in Bogota, a judge stares at a sealed envelope labeled only with his own name, and yet Jorge remains composed. As chaos crackles at the edges of the cartel's operations, he doesn't panic. He pivots. His instincts sharpen. He's seen what happens when power becomes noisy. Escobar's headlines, Gotcha's standoffs, Later's political rants, all drawing heat, all distracting. Jorge's brand of control is different. He doesn't draw a line in the sand. He fades into the mist. But there's one thing he can't ignore. The Cali cartel is watching. Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela, the cool-eyed brothers from Cali, had always been a looming presence, respectful, distanced, but undeniably ambitious. For a while, the Medellín and Cali groups operated on parallel tracks, rivals in style but not in open war. Cali handled Europe and some of the eastern U.S. Medellín focused on Miami and beyond. There was even collaboration, especially in the early phases, but by 1983, things begin to shift. Cali wants more. More routes, more ports, more say. And Jorge? Jorge notices the glances growing sharper. At a fundraiser for regional infrastructure, both cartels' representatives attend. On the surface, it's all champagne and speeches. But Jorge catches Miguel's expression when Escobar is mentioned. A flicker of disdain, a tightening of the jaw. Later that night, Jorge makes a note in his ledger. Not of finances, but of tone. He knows a storm is coming. Mainstream historical fact. The rivalry between Medellín and Cali would later erupt into open bloodshed, contributing to the cartel civil wars of the 1990s. But the seeds of that hostility were sown during these quieter years, when diplomacy was thin and ambition ran thick. Jorge doesn't seek conflict. He seeks continuity. So he begins reinforcing alliances. He reaffirms deals with logistics firms, strengthens political relationships, and expands his banking reach, not just to move money, but to keep eyes looking elsewhere. One of his most strategic moves comes in the form of a warehouse, a nondescript facility in a port town that had previously moved mostly cattle feed and corn. Under Jorge's quiet guidance, it's outfitted with specialized packaging equipment, air purification systems, and an office front that never stops smiling. No drugs are stored there. That's the trick. It only processes packaging, routes, and documentation. But the facility's entire purpose is to make the next shipment possible. Jorge calls it the factory of nothing. The employees think they work in logistics, and technically they do. There's an open, scholarly debate among historians. Was Jorge's long game designed to build independence from Medellín altogether? Did he foresee the collapse and try to create his own quiet kingdom away from the blast radius? So what do you think? Is a man who plans exit routes before a meeting ends really someone who just wanted to avoid heat? Meanwhile, Escobar is growing restless. He wants expansion. He wants faster shipments. He wants louder power. Jorge cautions patience. At a cartel summit near Pereira, Jorge lays out a 3-month proposal for route efficiency. Escobar interrupts by slamming a fist on the table and declaring he wants New York City in 6 weeks. The room falls quiet. Jorge folds his papers, waits, and then simply says, "Fast empires fall faster." Escobar smirks. "Then we'll build 2. That's the moment Jorge knows they're heading toward divergent paths. Do you remember the Panama Connection? It was subtle. A Panamanian trade representative visited one of Jorge's ranches under the guise of evaluating Colombian livestock diplomacy. They sat on a patio, sipped iced coffee, and spoke for 3 hours. No notes were taken, no contracts signed. But 2 weeks later, a Panamanian firm connected to that same representative began handling Jorge's overseas wire transfers. Coincidence? Hardly. Jorge begins using Panama as a pivot point, not just for money, but for political cover. He attends agricultural forums, wine tastings, diplomatic conferences, all perfectly innocent on the surface. Below that surface, however, is a current strong enough to move millions undetected. And in these moments, he starts to feel the strain, not from fear, but from complexity. Managing so many moving pieces requires constant vigilance. One cracked gear, one talkative middleman, one nervous pilot, and the entire machine could seize. So Jorge begins trimming. He reduces contact with certain players, cancels shipments that feel rushed. He stops taking calls directly from Escobar. Instead, communications pass through vetted intermediaries. This isn't disrespect. It's insulation. At home, Marta notices the change. He speaks less at dinner, stares longer at his aquarium, watching the silent glide of koi fish beneath filtered lights. She doesn't ask. She simply places his coffee where he likes it, touches his shoulder when passing, and leaves his office door slightly ajar in case he wants to talk. He never does. But one evening, she enters quietly and says, "The garden needs trimming. So does your circle." Jorge looks up, eyes narrowing slightly. He doesn't reply. But the next morning, 3 names are crossed off a ledger. One is a pilot who recently bought a second house without explanation. Another is a customs agent who started asking too many questions. The third is an accountant who missed a decimal and didn't notice. None of them are harmed. They simply disappear from the operation. That's Jorge's style. No drama, just deletion. Meanwhile, The DEA starts sniffing louder. One of Jorge's smaller front companies is flagged in a financial review. Nothing definitive, just irregularities. A few calls later, the review is quietly postponed. But Jorge takes it as a sign. He begins drafting a new strategy, one involving layered insulation, more trusted proxies, and fewer direct links. If Medellín is burning from within, he'll build a quiet satellite outside the blast radius. But before he can, a new name enters the picture. A young U.S. assistant attorney named Linda, stationed in Miami, begins compiling connections between cartel activity and American real estate purchases. She's tenacious, smart, unafraid, and one name keeps circling her desk. Ochoa. No hard evidence, just too many coincidences, too many cash spikes. One afternoon, Linda shows up at a Coral Gables property registered to a logistics firm connected to Jorge's cattle operations. She walks the perimeter, takes notes. Inside, a receptionist texts a secure line. That message reaches a phone in Jorge's Medellín office. He stares at the screen, then sets it down, wordless. That night, he calls Marta onto the patio and says, "The wind's shifting again." She nods. "Will we pivot?" Jorge exhales. "No, we'll glide." And so the glide begins. Slow, methodical, almost imperceptible, but make no mistake. The businessman is preparing for turbulence. From the air, the Colombian countryside looks like a watercolor. Lush greens bleeding into muddy trails. Clouds draped over the Andes like sleepy drunks over bar stools. Nestled within that haze are villas with no names, coordinates never printed, and labs that don't appear on maps. These are the jungle outposts of the Medellín Cartel, and Jorge Luis Ochoa, ever the businessman, helps design them as if they're high-end logistics parks. He never picks up a machete, never mixes the chemicals, never even breathes the raw product. But he maps the flows, the inputs, the yields, the optimal distance from roads and radar. He brings executive precision to criminal terrain. One of his earliest builds is a lab site in Caquetá. It begins as a cattle research outpost. That's what the paperwork says. It's even equipped with troughs, barn lights, and a few emaciated cows for show. But beneath that rustic disguise are corrugated panels, imported distillation equipment, and a lab team flown in from Bolivia, men who call Jorge Señor Contabilidad behind his back. He never corrects them. He smiles, because he knows. It's the numbers that keep the whole thing breathing. Mainstream historical fact. By 1984, Colombia was producing roughly 70% of the world's cocaine. While Escobar and Ochoa secured jungle routes with brute force, it was Ochoa's logistical vision that ensured consistent, industrial-scale output. His facilities weren't chaotic drug kitchens. They were streamlined, near-clinical environments. Jorge treated every kilo like inventory. He visits these sites rarely and never unannounced. When he arrives, his convoy is small. 2 SUVs, a personal assistant, a satchel with ledger sheets, and an old calculator that never leaves his side. The lab foremen scramble, not in fear, but in a kind of reverent panic. Everything must be in order. Numbers reconciled. No contamination, no deviations. Do you remember the technician with the broken scale? Jorge arrives one humid morning and reviews the week's output. Something's off. The yields are too high, the numbers too clean. He walks calmly to the weighing station, lifts the scale, and flips it over. A loose screw clinks onto the table. The technician stammers. Jorge says nothing. He simply hands the man an envelope. Inside, a plane ticket. One way, no return. The technician leaves that night. Not killed, not threatened, just removed. That's how Jorge works. Mistakes are handled like off-balance accounts. Quietly corrected, then closed. Meanwhile, the labs flourish. Each one is surrounded by layers of plausible deniability. ranch staff, security listed as wildlife wardens, satellite dishes used for weather monitoring. Jorge even installs water filtration systems and air quality monitors, not out of health concerns, but to reduce risk of detection from aerial surveillance. It's the kind of foresight you'd expect from a tech CEO, not a narco. Marta calls them the paradise warehouses. She visits one once, briefly. Jorge insists she stay in the upper villa, not the lab area. She doesn't protest, but later that night she asks him, "Is it worth it?" He doesn't answer immediately, then softly, "If it runs well, it lasts longer." That's Jorge's obsession. Not profit, not prestige. Longevity. He knows the average cartel career is short, brutal, and ends in blood. He doesn't want to win the war. He wants to retire. And to do that, the engine must run clean, even if the fuel is dirty. Many people still think jungle labs were chaotic dens of lawlessness. So what do you think? Could a man with a degree in finance and an allergy to chaos really tolerate anything less than full efficiency? Jorge even runs mock raids on his own labs. Once every few months, he sends in a team posing as police to test the facility's response times. The foremen hate it. The guards sweat. But the drills work. One lab averts a real raid by relocating its inventory 2 hours in advance, thanks to a protocol Jorge tested 3 weeks earlier. He's not playing cartel games. He's building a silent empire. But there are cracks, soft ones at first. One of his sites in Meta province receives a surprise visit from Army intelligence. They find nothing, officially. But Jorge knows it's only a matter of time before the quiet jungle stops being so quiet. So he begins expansion into more remote areas, places where maps are guesses, and the only rule is the one enforced by the man with the cleanest boots. He hires ex-military logistics experts, men who once plotted jungle deployments and now plot supply chain blueprints. The facilities get smarter. Some are mobile. Others are designed to self-destruct, not explode, just vanish. Hidden doors, burnable paperwork, collapsible tents. At one lab, every document is printed on dissolvable rice paper. He adds one new rule to every site. No phones, no radios, no noise. Still, the growth draws attention. Rival groups begin sniffing around. There's a whispered story, never confirmed, about a FARC unit that tried to shake down one of Jorge's satellite labs. The foreman offered them a cattle shipment. They accepted. 2 weeks later, they returned for more. No confrontation, no gunfight, just a new tax. Jorge doesn't mind. It's overhead. As the jungle blooms with laboratories dressed like ranches, Jorge's time in Medellín shrinks. He becomes more nomadic, rarely in one place longer than a week. Each trip is layered in alibis. He attends livestock symposiums. He meets with foreign veterinarians. He even hosts a workshop on sustainable ranch management. A DEA analyst in Bogotá raises an eyebrow when Jorge's passport shows 10 domestic flights in a month, all booked through different agents. The report is filed, but no action is taken. Coincidence? He smiles again. The labs are now producing at scale. Shipments fly out weekly. Small, frequent, less traceable. Jorge insists on compartmentalization. No one person sees more than one leg of the journey. Pilots don't know suppliers. Packers don't know destinations. It's like a theater where everyone knows their line, but not the plot. And through it all, Jorge keeps his ledgers tight. There's a notebook, bound in leather, that never leaves his briefcase. Inside are numbers. Just numbers. No names. But anyone reading it would be stunned at the precision. Inputs, outputs, route codes, efficiency ratios. Jorge runs the cocaine trade like a logistics startup. One day, Marta finds the notebook. She flips through it in silence, Then she places it back and says, "This book is heavier than it looks." He nods. Most ledgers are. That night, they dine on the porch, listening to the wind move through the trees. Jorge says little. He's thinking about a new lab, deeper in the jungle, near a river that's never been mapped properly. The business is running smoother than ever, but he knows smoother waters mean faster currents, and when you're that far from shore, you better know how to swim. In Washington, D.C., the mood is shifting. What was once whispered in corridors is now being printed in memos stamped with words like critical threat, regional destabilization, and international cooperation. The White House isn't just worried about cocaine anymore. It's worried about where the money's going, who it's buying, and how deep it's already sunk into Latin America's institutions. Jorge Luis Ochoa doesn't need an intelligence briefing to know this. He can feel it in the way flights are watched more closely, in the way embassy parties grow stiffer, in the way the soft smiles of officials turn into quiet phone calls requesting a little space. Even the coffee tastes more bitter. The Americans are waking up. He adapts. When Washington starts whispering, Jorge starts traveling less. His phone calls get shorter. His paperwork gets tighter. He shifts assets into less conspicuous forms: cattle, land, gemstones. Anything that doesn't draw a signature. Back in Colombia, whispers become meetings. A senior contact in the Justice Ministry calls him to suggest that he cool things off for a while. Jorge nods politely. "We're already at a simmer," he replies. But the truth is, the Americans aren't targeting Escobar anymore. They want the financiers, the men behind the curtain, the ones who make the empire look like a ranch with slightly unusual accounting. And Jorge? He's the crown jewel of that category. Mainstream historical fact. In 1984, the United States and Colombia signed new agreements to increase collaboration on extradition and anti-narcotics enforcement. This came after years of increasing cartel violence and growing frustration in Washington over the seeming impunity of men like Ochoa and Escobar. Many people still think that extradition was invented for the loudest criminals. But so what do you think? Could a treaty really be drafted without first identifying the quiet ones it was truly meant to corner? The first sign that things are turning comes through an old friend in Miami, an attorney who once helped set up a few legal holding companies for Jorge. One afternoon, he sends a cable. Coffee's too hot. Guests asking for receipts. Jorge doesn't panic, but he understands. He begins dismantling certain shells. He orders accounts closed, rerouted, re-registered under new intermediaries. He suspends 2 flights, cancels a land transfer near Barranquilla, even sells off a prized racehorse, an animal he once refused a Saudi prince for. All of this quietly, efficiently. The goal: reduce visibility, increase plausible deniability. Meanwhile, DEA agents in Bogota are running high on caffeine and low on patience. They've got warrants, wiretaps, and political backing, but they don't have proof. Jorge's name comes up again and again in seized ledgers, but never attached directly to anything criminal. He remains somehow untouched. But Washington wants a head, preferably one with a polite smile and a college degree. And so begins a campaign, not with bullets, but with paper. An arrest warrant is drafted, not in Colombia, but in the U.S. Southern District of Florida. Jorge is charged in absentia for conspiracy to import narcotics. It's vague, strategic, just enough to trigger pressure for extradition, without revealing how little they really have on him. Jorge gets the news while riding on horseback through a valley near his ranch. A radio call comes through. He doesn't respond immediately. He dismounts, lights a cigarette, and watches the clouds roll in. Then he tells the rider beside him, "We'll need a lawyer, preferably one who drinks tea and sleeps well." He already knows who to call. Back in Medellín, the family reacts. His father, Don Fabio, wants to call in favors. His brothers want to flex. Jorge tells them all to wait, because here's the thing. Extradition isn't automatic. It's a process, a legal labyrinth with hundreds of levers. And Jorge? Jorge has memorized the maze. He begins mobilizing contacts, not to hide, but to delay. A lawyer in Bogota files a motion. A sympathetic judge declares the warrant overbroad. A senator calls for a review of the treaty itself. In the papers, Jorge is described as a respected rancher unfairly targeted by foreign overreach. At home, Marta folds laundry as the news runs. A reporter says Jorge's name 3 times in a single sentence. She doesn't flinch, just switches the channel. You remember that interview, don't you? A journalist from a major magazine tries to corner Jorge at a charity event. Microphone out, cameras nearby. He asks, "Señor Ochoa, are you involved in narcotics trafficking?" Jorge doesn't pause. He replies, "I'm involved in cattle, and Colombia is full of bulls." The clip goes viral, before viral was even a concept, but the pressure keeps building. DEA agents are now stationed at every major Colombian airport. Customs officers receive American advisors. The U.S. Embassy increases its security presence. Jorge tightens his circle. One accountant is let go. A shipping partner is retired, gracefully, with a golden handshake and a promise to stay out of sight. The entire fleet of ranch vehicles is updated with new registrations, new routes. Still, the pressure leaks into his daily life. The gardener starts glancing over his shoulder more. His children are followed once on the way to school. Marta's friend is questioned at an embassy cocktail party. The atmosphere has changed. The polished front now reflects too much light, and that's when the phone rings. A senior cartel figure is on the line. Voice hushed, tone urgent. "There's talk," he says. "You're being made the test case." Jorge exhales slowly. The tea in his cup has gone cold. "They'll try to extradite you first," the voice continues. "Before Escobar, before anyone. Because Jorge is the least likely. Because Jorge makes it look too easy." That night he sits at his desk, ledger open, pen unmoving. Across the page is a column labeled "Next Moves." Underneath, just one word: neutralize. But Jorge doesn't mean violence. He means lawyers, diplomats, judges, journalists, all moving in perfect sequence. He means reminding the state that arresting Jorge Luis Ochoa isn't just about crime. It's about consequences. Economic, political, institutional. His empire doesn't rest on brute force. It rests on fragile deals. And breaking those deals? That's dangerous for everyone. The legal storm brews fast. By the end of 1984, Jorge Luis Ochoa isn't just a name on whispers and ledgers anymore. He's a name inked into indictments, typed in all caps across pages stamped by U.S. courts. The official word: conspiracy to import narcotics into the United States. The unofficial message: we finally found the quiet one. But Colombia isn't so quick to hand him over. Extradition, after all, is a touchy thing. It pricks national pride, raises constitutional eyebrows, and flirts with riots in the streets. Colombia's laws at the time make it legally ambiguous whether a native-born citizen can be sent abroad for trial. Jorge knows this. He's counted on it. He doesn't hide, doesn't run. He simply stays still and waits for the system to argue with itself. Then one morning, something absurd happens. A judge signs a warrant, formally approving Jorge's arrest. But when police attempt to serve it, a clerk discovers the paperwork is missing a crucial signature. Just not there. A single page is unsigned, unstamped, unfiled. No one knows who forgot, or if they forgot at all. So the officers return, empty-handed. And Jorge, Well, he smiles. Mainstream historical fact. In several high-profile cases during the mid-1980s, Colombian judges either misplaced key documents or resigned on the eve of major extradition rulings. The legal system was in a state of quiet paralysis, caught between American demands and cartel influence. One such case was widely believed to involve Jorge, whose warrant stalled in a paperwork quagmire. Many people still think Jorge bribed his way out of extradition. But so what do you think? Could a man so meticulous have relied on bribes alone? Or did he design a legal maze so dense it swallowed its own trail? He takes the delay as a sign, a pause, a breath, but not a reprieve. Because outside Colombia, things are changing. U.S. agents are now lobbying directly with foreign governments. Interpol gets involved. His name lands on international watch lists, bank flags. Even the Vatican's bank, once used by Latin American elites to quietly secure funds, begins tightening scrutiny. So Jorge starts tightening too. He closes half his shell companies, converts assets into commodities, gold, cattle, even coffee futures. He buys an entire vineyard in Argentina under the name of a distant cousin, claiming a lifelong passion for Malbec grapes. He begins using face-to-face messengers again. No phones, no faxes, just trusted men with memorized phrases, memorized routes, and no written notes. Even Marta notices the change. She finds a sealed envelope on the desk one morning. Inside is a list of emergency contacts, lawyers, doctors, pilots. She places it back without comment. That night, she sets an extra place at dinner. Empty, but symbolic. Jorge just raises an eyebrow. She smiles. Just in case we have to leave quickly. It's not fear she's feeling. It's readiness. At this point, the Medellín Cartel is a hydra with 1,000 heads. Escobar is becoming a national figure, part saint, part monster. Gotcha is off blowing up anything that irritates him. Leader, in the Bahamas, is descending into paranoia and tropical bravado. Jorge? He's reviewing maritime insurance contracts, because if you're going to ship $5 million worth of product through a fishing fleet, you'd better know what happens if a storm sinks the boat. He's also begun experimenting with legal pressure tactics. Through a shell foundation, he files a civil suit in Colombia against a foreign journalist who named him in an article. The grounds: defamation and damage to commercial reputation. The judge laughs privately, but publicly, the suit stalls further publications. That's how Jorge operates. Not through fire, but through friction. Slowing things, nudging them, buying time with bureaucracy. Then comes the moment. Late one night, just before midnight, Jorge is driving with 2 associates on a rural road near Medellín. Police stop the car. The officers are polite, respectful even, but insistent. They have orders, and this time the paperwork is all there. Jorge steps out calmly, adjusts his cuffs, says nothing. The next morning's headline reads, Jorge Ochoa apprehended in surprise operation. Marta reads it in the kitchen, then pours herself a second cup of coffee. There's panic in the streets. His name isn't just known now, it's explosive. Rumors swirl. He'll be extradited within the week. He'll be flown out tonight. He'll be silenced before he talks. But nothing happens, because something else is at work, something far more complicated than handcuffs. Jorge is placed in detention, not prison, not yet. And in those gray walls of legal limbo, he starts moving again, not with his feet, but with his allies. A group of senators calls for a judicial review. Businessmen write op-eds decrying foreign manipulation. Protests break out, some sincere, others sponsored. Do you remember the joke one journalist printed? Ochoa's jail cell has better coffee than the courthouse. He doesn't deny it. He requests Colombian newspapers, fresh fruit, and a copy of the civil code. All are delivered. Outside, the American ambassador demands swift action, extradition, cooperation, compliance. Inside, Jorge smiles through his glass window. He plays chess with a fellow detainee. The guards don't know who the other man is. Probably no one. Or someone. One night, he receives a visit from a government liaison. The man doesn't sit, just stands and says, "They're watching." Jorge replies, "Let them. I've never done anything they can prove." And that's the heart of it. There are no wiretaps, no fingerprints, no photos of bricks or planes or jungle labs. Just ledgers, just shadows. He remains in detention for weeks. During that time, the legal war intensifies. Lawyers file motions. The press grows hungrier. The American embassy leaks carefully crafted outrage. But the Colombian courts don't move. Why? Because Jorge is a symbol, a test case, and Colombia isn't ready to set that precedent. Finally, the court rules, no extradition. The paperwork is filed, stamped, signed. This time, no page is missing. He walks out in a clean shirt and sunglasses, to a wall of flashbulbs and 1,000 shouted questions. He doesn't speak. He simply gets in the car. That night, at home, Marta serves dinner as usual. He eats quietly, then says, "We want a delay. Not a victory, just time. And in this business, time is everything." The house is quiet again. No more late-night calls from lawyers, no police circling the block, no fresh subpoenas sliding under heavy oak doors. But silence can be deceptive. Jorge Luis Ochoa knows this well. Silence is not peace. It's pause. And in the aftermath of his non-extradition release, the quiet is louder than ever. Outside his walls, Colombia is boiling. Escobar is raging against the state. Judges are assassinated in broad daylight. Entire newsrooms are relocated for safety. Jorge watches this chaos unfold from a leather chair, glass of rum in hand, his eyes never blinking during the evening news. He sees the line they've crossed now. The Medellín Cartel is no longer an economic phenomenon. It's a war. And wars don't reward accountants, so he makes adjustments, not outwardly. To the public, he's still the composed cattleman, recently cleared of unfair accusations. He attends mass, hosts dinner parties, makes small tactical appearances at charitable events, but behind closed doors, he's shifting the structure. No more expansion, no more risky routes, only reinforcement. Mainstream historical fact. Following a wave of public outcry and political debate, the Colombian Supreme Court invalidated the extradition of nationals to the United States in 1987, a legal win largely celebrated by cartel members, especially Jorge Ochoa, whose own case had become the litmus test for sovereignty versus foreign pressure. Many people still think Jorge's legal escape meant he was untouchable. But so, what do you think? Could a man so deeply rooted in systems not know that legal victories age poorly when politics catch fire? He begins downsizing. 2 shell companies dissolve. Several outposts in the jungle go dark. Certain pilots stop receiving assignments. Not fired, just not needed anymore. His brothers don't like it. Juan David wants to push harder. Fabio Jr. is restless. They see the current as manageable. Jorge sees it as rising. In a family meeting at the hacienda, voices rise. Jorge listens. Then, finally, calmly, "This isn't a fight we can win with numbers," and that's the pivot. He's no longer interested in growth. He's interested in preservation. He initiates what will later be referred to, privately, as the curtain. It's a slow process of withdrawal. Not a disappearance, but a dimming. Operations begin moving under new names. Trusted lieutenants are quietly promoted into more visible roles. Jorge starts appearing in fewer documents. The empire doesn't shrink. It becomes mist. Meanwhile, the American campaign intensifies. Media outlets run exposés on the Ochoa family. Wire service pieces profile the gentleman of Medellín, painting them as urbane criminals with dangerous charm. One magazine publishes a photo of Jorge in a white shirt, smiling beside a senator at a polo match. It circulates fast. That same week, a bank in Curaçao freezes one of his accounts. He doesn't argue, he reroutes. You remember the banker in Panama? A quiet man named Ramos. He used to handle wire transfers for a shipping cooperative. Now he handles silence. Jorge trusts him, mostly because Ramos never smiles. One day, Ramos calls to say, "They asked me for your signature history." Jorge replies, "You didn't give it?" "I told them I'm not sure you even sign anything." Ramos chuckles once. They hang up. In Colombia, the line between business and politics is fracturing. The government, embarrassed by growing foreign criticism, begins cracking down, half-heartedly. Raids are staged, arrests made, photos leaked. Jorge isn't touched, but his circle is shrinking, so he turns inward. He starts spending more time at his country estate outside Medellín. There, the trees are taller, the guards more distant, and the horizon uncluttered by city noise. Marta joins him most days. She gardens, reads, watches him sip coffee and stare at ledgers he never seems to finish. One afternoon she asks, "What's the next number?" He looks at her. For the first time in years, shrugs. That night, she places a candle beside the ledger. Then maybe let it rest. He doesn't open it for 3 days. Then the phone rings. It's a lawyer, soft voice, careful words. U.S. authorities are working with Spain. Extradition through a third-party route is on the table. Jorge exhales, looks out at the field. 2 horses are grazing. A dog sleeps by the gate. "Thank you," he says. "Call me if it becomes real." But it is real. He knows it. So he takes further steps. He transfers key properties to relatives. Begins consolidating accounts into fewer jurisdictions. His face disappears from ownership papers. His name becomes an echo in bureaucracies that once held him at the center. And yet, he's not hiding. He still attends local events, still donates, still walks to Mass with Marta on Sundays, nodding to neighbors, tipping his hat, because his power was never in visibility. It was in interpretation. You remember that day with the judge? At a private conference on narcotics law, a retired magistrate approaches Jorge quietly and says, "I'm not here to condemn you." Jorge nods. The man continues, "But I do wonder, how much longer can you run a business in a house where every wall has ears?" Jorge replies, "You don't run it. You rent it to someone who doesn't mind the noise." The man blinks. Jorge walks away. That's the strategy now. Sublet the empire. Lease the lanes. Step back without stepping down. Even Escobar notices, during a tense phone call, one of their last. Pablo tells Jorge, "You're turning into a ghost." Jorge replies, "Better a ghost than a headline." Pablo laughs. Headlines last longer. Jorge doesn't respond, because he knows they don't. Not when the next one comes with your address, your bank code, your face. So he stays silent, watches the empire hum without him, and for the first time in years, sleeps. It's late 1985, and Jorge Luis Ochoa's empire hums beneath the surface like a well-oiled submarine. Quiet, smooth, and invisible to anyone not listening carefully. His name no longer buzzes in headlines like Escobar's. Instead, it circulates in controlled whispers. And that's just the way he likes it. Because in war, there are bullets. But in business, there are balances. And Jorge, above all, is still playing the long game. At the hacienda, the days are slower now. He still rises early, still walks the fields with a notebook. But he talks less, reads more. Every newspaper, every financial report. He looks for patterns, for signs. Not in the bold print, but in the margins. Marta notices he lingers longer in the study. The radio stays on, but lower. The phone rings less, but when it does, it's for longer stretches. When she asks who it is, he just says, "Old clients. Some are still loyal. Some are just remembering they owe me something, and that's how it works now." Jorge isn't directing the river anymore. He's watching the current, making sure the dam doesn't crack. But tensions are rising within the organization itself. Gotcha grows impatient. He wants muscle on the street. Escobar wants power in Congress. Jorge wants insulation. At a summit in Antioquia, the three sit at opposite corners of a long wooden table. There's wine, there's food, but not a lot of warmth. Pablo jokes too loudly. Gotcha drums his fingers. Jorge takes notes. Finally, Pablo leans forward and says, "We're not farmers, Jorge." "No," Jorge replies. "But if you burn the crops too early, you harvest nothing. It's not a threat. It's a forecast." Still, the Medellín Cartel has momentum, and momentum doesn't wait for caution. Soon, a U.S. intelligence memo describes Jorge as the architect of financial insulation within the cartel structure. They don't know how much he controls, but they know the structure bends when he moves. Mainstream historical fact. In 1986, U.S. agencies began deploying financial task forces aimed at following the money behind major drug operations. These groups often found themselves blocked by layers of corporate protections and offshore accounts, many of which they later admitted bore traces of Ochoa's intricate systems. Many people still think that Jorge faded into the background out of fear. But so, what do you think? Could a man who ran an empire by spreadsheet ever willingly lose sight of his margins? Back home, Jorge makes subtle moves. He stops attending major events, begins using Marta's name on property transactions, transfers stewardship of several logistics routes to younger, less-known figures. They're loyal, but more importantly, they're invisible. He creates a buffer, not just legally, personally. He tells his children to stay inside the country, tells his nephews to switch careers. A few listen. Most don't. That's the problem with empires. You can quiet the machinery, but the rust still spreads if the workers think they're immortal. One night, a trusted associate arrives at the hacienda, sweating, panicked. "The Americans know about the Panama route," he says. "They froze the northern leg. 3 million gone." Jorge doesn't flinch. "Did they touch the horses?" "No." "Then we're fine, because that's the contingency plan. If the routes collapse, the horses sell. If the accounts freeze, the land moves." Jorge has always layered his systems like Matryoshka dolls. Remove one, there's another, and another, and another. You remember the vineyard, right? The one in Argentina? It just so happens that it exported barrels labeled dark table wine to Spain. Wine that never tasted like anything because the barrels were never opened. They were swapped mid-transit, legal paperwork intact. And guess who owned the shipping line? A company that used to breed cattle. Coincidence? He shrugs when asked. Around this time, journalists begin digging deeper. Not the tabloids, but the thoughtful ones. The kind who call your lawyer before they call you. One reaches out for a quote. "Senor Ochoa," she writes, "how do you feel about being portrayed as the civilized face of the cartel?" Jorge replies with a handwritten note. "Politeness is not a disguise. Sometimes it's a decision." That quote gets published. He frames the clipping, quietly amused, but not everything stays amusing. The government, under increased pressure, begins circulating new laws. Asset seizures, cross-border cooperation agreements. Escobar responds with fire. Jorge responds with movement. He pulls out of 2 operations entirely, tells his people, "Let them be the flames. We'll be the wind." One accountant doesn't understand. Jorge replaces him. At night, he talks to Marta, less about numbers and more about futures, real futures. He wants to retire. Real retirement. not just in name, but in rhythm. He wants to slow down, raise horses, sleep through the night, but Marta sees the lines on his face, the way he flinches when the phone rings, the way he double-checks his briefcase, even when it hasn't moved. He's still calculating, always. Then comes the news. A colleague, a well-connected banker in Panama, has disappeared. Not arrested. Gone. Within an hour, Jorge orders 6 transfers, sells 2 properties, sends 1 message. Freeze branch C. He doesn't wait to verify, he assumes the worst. Later, the banker resurfaces, drunk, lost track of time on a beach. Jorge doesn't unfreeze the branch, because if a system relies on one man, it's already broken. Around this time, he starts taking meetings on horseback. Not at the hacienda, but out in the hills. Remote, uncluttered, calm. 2 men, 1 guard, 1 thermos of coffee. That's all. They discuss routes, margins, risk, but no longer growth, only reduction. And this is Jorge's new game, contraction by design. He's still in control, but now it's about preparing for absence, quietly training others to steer while pretending he's still behind the wheel. One night, Marta finds him in the study, staring at a ledger. She asks, "What are you calculating?" "Time," he says. "How much I have left to exit without a sound." And that's the art of it. Not vanishing suddenly, but fading, so gradually that no one notices until the door's already closed. It's 1986, and Jorge Luis Ochoa has turned evaporation into strategy, while the Medellín Cartel spirals toward volatility. Firebombs, headlines, and vendettas, Jorge becomes something else entirely. Not absent, not retired, but atmospheric. He's there, if you know where to look. But more often, he's the reason something doesn't go wrong, not the hand making things go right. This is the phase of the managed fade. He attends fewer meetings, delegates even more. When partners ask, "Where's Jorge?" the answer is never exact. On the ranch, in Panama, resting, all possibly true, none confirmable. But his systems? They still function like a luxury watch behind smoked glass. Many people still think Jorge quit while he was ahead. But so what do you think? Could a man who builds trapdoors beneath his trapdoors ever truly stop watching the ceiling? The fade is deliberate. He reshapes the very structure of cartel interaction. He creates diplomatic corridors. Not actual diplomacy, of course, but the cartel equivalent. A soft-spoken emissary here, a respectful courier there. Every high-tension meeting now has someone present who answers to Jorge, even if no one realizes it. Meanwhile, his brothers struggle with the optics. Juan David, more brash, wants to stay visible. Fabio Jr. thinks they should fight extradition with flair. Jorge listens, nods, and continues fading. At the same time, Escobar's war with the state intensifies. The assassination of presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galan is still years away, but the seeds are already sown. Bombings become common. Political tensions thicken like jungle heat. Jorge feels the air change, feels how quickly one man's vision can scorch a country. He schedules fewer phone calls. Marta starts noticing bags by the door more often. Not packed, but ready. And then comes one of the quietest storms of Jorge's career, a bank in Spain. One he's used discreetly for years. Flags a set of transactions for irregular volume. It's bureaucratic speak, but he understands what it means. The Americans are sharing more data now, and they're closing in on the money, not just the men. Mainstream historical fact. In the mid-1980s, the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, began pushing for anti-money laundering standards globally. Though Colombia wasn't an early adopter, European pressure began mounting on offshore havens and banks suspected of helping narco-traffickers. So Jorge reacts. He rotates capital through gemstones, a notoriously unregulated market. Emeralds, uncut diamonds, a few sapphires. He stores them in Swiss vaults, then stops storing anything in his own name. Even his horses now are listed under third-tier shell companies in Uruguay. You remember the one called Silver Quiet? A stallion Jorge adored. A champion. But when the holding company that owned Silver Quiet was subpoenaed, Jorge didn't fight. He sold the horse the next week, cheaply, to a small-time breeder who had no idea what he was buying. The message? Even beloved assets are expendable. Jorge's version of loyalty doesn't include attachment. Still, not everything can be rotated away. That's when the million-dollar question lands in his lap. What happens if his name lands on a U.S. blacklist? Not an indictment, something softer. A Treasury Department asset freeze, a denial of banking rights, a political death sentence for anyone who touches his money. It's hypothetical at first, but the possibility sends a ripple through the old channels. His banker in Curacao stops replying. A property deal in Costa Rica collapses with no explanation. Even a long, loyal logistics manager starts making calls Jorge doesn't authorize. He responds with precision. He flies, quietly, to Panama, meets with a trusted lawyer, hands him 3 envelopes. One is to be opened if any U.S. list includes my name. The second, if Marta is detained. The third has no label. He returns home and doesn't mention the trip. That week, he orders new security protocols. The gates are reinforced. Guards rotate differently. Phone lines change. Not drastically. Just enough to give an old empire a new rhythm. Marta finally confronts him one evening. "This is not a fade anymore," she says. "This is exit velocity." He nods, pouring her a glass of wine. "I'm not vanishing," he says. "I'm becoming optional." And in that line lies the truth. Jorge doesn't want to disappear. He wants to no longer be needed. His greatest triumph won't be surviving. It'll be building a structure that runs without him, without collapse. So he tests it. For a full week, he vanishes. No calls, no meetings, no instructions. Operations proceed uninterrupted. Shipments land, payments clear. Contacts report no abnormalities. When he returns, Marta simply says, "They didn't miss you." And Jorge, tired, still dressed in travel gray, smiles with something close to pride. But danger isn't gone. It just has a new scent. During a scheduled drop in Mexico, a mid-level associate is arrested. Nothing major. He's clean on paper. But while in custody, he talks. Not about Jorge directly, but about a network of advisors that keeps the route stable. The U.S. gets wind of it. They open a new investigation. Quiet. Focused. A document lands on the desk of a young analyst in D.C. Her supervisor circles a name with a red pen. Ochoa. No title. No timestamp. Just the name. Coincidence? Jorge assumes not. So, he begins constructing what he calls the invisible firewall. Not digital. Personal. A system of plausible deniability so thick, even he can't remember where the money came from. Marta finds him one night, surrounded by ledgers and oil lamps, muttering to himself. "Are we safe?" she asks. "Not yet," he says, "but close." And in that moment, she realizes what he's truly building. Not a drug empire, not even a retirement plan, but a silence so structured, it can absorb any question without leaving an answer behind. The closer Jorge Luis Ochoa moves toward silence, the louder the world becomes. By 1987, the Medellín Cartel is less a business and more a battlefield. Government officials are dying. Judges are fleeing the country. News anchors speak with panic in their throats, and armored convoys crawl through city streets like steel ants on edge. Escobar is no longer a name whispered behind hands. He's a force of nature now, erupting in headlines, threats, and the rubble of car bombs. Jorge watches from a distance. Not exiled, not retired, just repositioned. He's moved most of his operations outside the fire zone. The jungle labs are pared down. The logistics centers are decentralized. His staff speak less, meet less, smile less. His family, still nestled in the folds of rural Colombia, live quietly behind taller fences and tighter routines. Marta no longer reads the papers aloud in the mornings. The silence is mutual, and yet despite the noise, Jorge's system still works. That's the brilliance of it. While bullets fly and newspapers burn, his roots hum along, not untouched. Nothing is untouched, but intact, reliable, predictable. Because Jorge's business isn't cocaine, it's continuity. Still, he can't help but notice a growing problem: the weight of being reasonable in unreasonable times. You remember the banker in Geneva? He was the last holdout. An old contact from Jorge's early days, trusted, discreet, expensive. For years, he moved millions with no more than a nod and a password. Then, one winter morning, Jorge receives a message. He's gone, not arrested, not missing, gone. Jorge doesn't react outwardly, but he knows. Either the man fled or he was silenced, and either way, it's the final warning. The old world is collapsing. Even the smart ones are slipping through the cracks. Mainstream historical fact. By the late 1980s, international financial watchdogs had begun tightening standards under U.S. pressure. Anonymous accounts were harder to open. Wire transfers faced more scrutiny. Switzerland, long a haven for secrecy, began folding under international glare. So Jorge responds the only way he knows how. He builds new channels. He buys a defunct import-export company in Uruguay and turns it into a cattle genetics supplier. The company never sells a single bull, but it does move crates, well-labeled, temperature-controlled, legally impeccable. He starts using antique dealers in Spain, not for laundering, but for confusion. Each shipment is paired with another, an item of obscure, high-appraised value. If intercepted, the paperwork is maddening. Customs officials don't know what's real and what's relic. That's the firewall now. Not just secrecy, complexity. And Jorge relishes it. He always has. Marta finds him diagramming flowcharts on the veranda one evening. Red pen, green pen, little notes in shorthand only he understands. She says, "You know it's not about the money anymore." He doesn't look up. "It never was," he replies. "It's about frictionless motion." She nods as if that makes perfect sense, because for Jorge, this isn't crime. It's choreography. And yet, the storm creeps closer. The Americans are frustrated. Too many operations fail. Too many names vanish into the folds of Jorge's organizational fabric. They begin pushing harder, not just through courts, but through politics. A list is leaked. The top 10 narco-traffickers in the world. Jorge's name is number 4. The irony, he hasn't touched a shipment directly in 2 years, but his systems still pulse. And that's enough. So what do you think? Could a man like Jorge ever be removed from the game if the board still uses his rules? You remember the jet, don't you? The one registered to a Venezuelan businessman, used only once, then parked for months. In late '87, it makes a quiet flight from Caracas to a ranch near the Colombian border. Jorge is on board. No guards. Just an advisor, a satchel, and a notebook. He meets with a man from Mexico, an up-and-comer with ideas and ambition. The meeting lasts one night. What's discussed isn't written. But afterward, new routes open through Central America, and Jorge returns home a few pounds lighter in worry. That same week, a prominent U.S. official gives a televised speech about the fracturing of the cartel hydra. Jorge smiles at the phrasing. Hydras are hard to kill, but easier to forget when they stop roaring. At the hacienda, things change again. He downsizes his staff, stops using the front office, reorganizes the garage into a quiet workspace with maps pinned along the walls, each marked not with locations, but with exits. His strategy now is minimalism. Fewer assets, fewer contacts, fewer risks. He keeps only what's essential: a pilot he trusts with silence, a lawyer with no address, a phone that rings once a week, then disappears into a drawer. One evening, Marta walks in and finds Jorge reading a book on aqueducts in ancient Rome. She asks, "Studying history now?" He shrugs. They knew how to move things invisibly. She pours him tea. Outside, the dogs bark, then stop. A car passes, then silence again. You'd never guess the man inside had once moved enough cocaine to alter a hemisphere's economy. He starts preparing a new ledger. One without numbers, just plans. In case of arrest, in case of defection, in case of a shift. Each page is labeled "if." It's not fear driving him, it's completion. Because Jorge knows he's not the last man standing. He's the last one walking toward the door, without being pushed. And as 1988 approaches, with Escobar burning bridges and Gotcha torching towns, Jorge's face grows calmer. He tells Marta one night, "It's time to start leaving shadows behind." "What will you leave instead?" she asks. He closes the notebook and replies, "Silhouettes. They're harder to follow." And with that, he begins walking backward into stillness. The air over Medellín hangs heavy, as if even the weather is bracing for the next explosion. By 1988, the Medellín Cartel is unraveling. Not completely, not yet, but the seams are fraying. Too many bodies, too many headlines, too many names shouted in anger and grief. Escobar's strategy is no longer political manipulation, it's total war. And Jorge Luis Ochoa? He is slipping between the threads, not because he's afraid, but because he refuses to become obvious. Inside the cartel, lines have hardened. Escobar trusts fewer people. Gotcha trusts no one. Communication is fragmentary, tense. Deals break down over tone, not numbers. The business has mutated. It's no longer about roots and percentages. It's about loyalty tests, vendettas, shifting alliances with militias, politicians, and ghosts. Jorge doesn't participate. He watches, he records, he prepares. Mainstream historical fact. By late 1988, the Colombian government and U.S. intelligence services had begun compiling complete organizational charts of the cartel. These included nicknames, aliases, financial threads, and suspected safe houses. Jorge was on nearly every version, but never at the top. Always just below. Close enough to matter. Far enough to delay action. Many people still think he was protected by favors. But so, what do you think? Could a man this organized rely on anything so fragile as loyalty? At the hacienda, Marta begins packing things into neat boxes, not to flee, just to be ready. She doesn't ask if they'll use them. Jorge doesn't say. You remember the incident at the checkpoint? One evening, returning from a supposed cattle inspection, Jorge's vehicle is stopped by police. Standard procedure, IDs, questions. The officer hesitates when he sees the name. There's a pause, then he waves them through. Later, Jorge tells Marta, "He looked at me like I'd already been erased." She replies, "Then maybe it's working." Because Jorge's goal isn't to vanish. It's to not be where they expect to find him. One by one, he begins handing off responsibilities. Not officially, not with signatures or ceremonies. Just a nod, a phrase, a silent withdrawal. Routes he once designed now run under new architects. Contacts call less frequently, not because they distrust him, but because they don't need to anymore. He's built a system that runs without hands. Still, the risks haven't vanished, only shifted. A friend in Panama is arrested. Not charged, but questioned. He gives nothing away. But Jorge reads the silence in his letters. The words that aren't written. The longer spaces between lines. So he writes a note of his own. Short, elegant. Your silence is remembered. It's never mailed. He stores it in a drawer with a dozen others like it. Small, polite acknowledgments of favors no one should talk about. This is Jorge's archive. Not files, not data, but human debt, folded quietly in half. And then finally, the formal notice arrives. A U.S. federal grand jury indictment, unsealed. His name, printed plainly. The charges: conspiracy, distribution, laundering. There's nothing new in it. No revelations. Just confirmation. He reads it over coffee, then folds it and slides it into a copy of The Prince by Machiavelli. When Marta enters the room, he says, "They've finally found what they were always going to write." She places her hand on his shoulder and then says nothing. What is there to say? Jorge begins preparing for what must come next. Not surrender, not escape, but the next version of distance. A private airstrip is put on standby. A lawyer in Spain is briefed. The notebook is updated. More pages titled, "If." But even now, Jorge does not act out of fear. He acts out of timing. Because the game is not who disappears first. It's who chooses to disappear at the right moment. And as Colombia sinks further into violence, bombs in malls, shootouts near schools, Jorge's house becomes strangely peaceful. Birdsong in the morning, horses brushing against fences, coffee that stays warm until the last sip. It's a contrast too sharp to ignore. Marta notices. One afternoon, she finds him in the stables, brushing a horse that hasn't been ridden in months. She says, "It's too quiet." He replies, "That's because everything loud has already played its part." And maybe he's right, because Escobar, still in Medellín, still defiant, is starting to unravel. His empire has no bottom floor. It just falls endlessly into chaos. His men grow paranoid. His accountants vanish. His rage turns inward. Jorge receives fewer updates now, not because he's out, because there's less to update. The machine is grinding itself down. And Jorge, he is polishing saddles, reviewing weather reports, reading about vineyards in Chile. He writes a letter to no one really, maybe to history, if silence ever needed a symbol. Let it be the man who left no ashes behind. He folds it, burns it, then walks outside, where the sun hits the fields in long yellow streaks. Everything smells like hay and rain, and something ending. That night, for the first time in a year, he sleeps for 8 uninterrupted hours, and when he wakes, he doesn't reach for the ledger. He pours coffee, sits beside Marta, and simply watches the sky turn from indigo to gray, because sometimes the quietest move is the last. The sun hangs heavy over the valley, its light slow and syrup thick, casting long shadows across Jorge Luis Ochoa's estate. Shadows that linger, stretch, and, like the man himself, refuse to settle in one place. It's 1989 now, and the world around Jorge is no longer just trembling. It's splitting. The Medellín Cartel, once a symphony of silence and synchronization, is fracturing into operatic chaos. Escobar's open war with the Colombian state has escalated past strategy and into desperation. Government buildings are under siege. Presidential candidates are assassinated. Civilians are caught in the crossfire. Every explosion rips another stitch from the social fabric. And Jorge? He's somewhere else entirely, not physically. He still walks the grounds of his estate, still reads the papers, still accepts visitors with the same measured smile. But mentally, he's on a different plane. He's not fighting the war. He's measuring its half-life. Mainstream historical fact. In December 1989, the U.S. government officially declared drug trafficking a national security threat. That same year, President George H.W. Bush launched Operation Just Cause in Panama, partly justified by Panama's role in laundering cartel money. The noose around the Medellín financiers was no longer a rumor. It was law. Many people still think Jorge disappeared before the fire reached his door. But so what do you think? Could a man with clocks inside clocks really not know exactly how many ticks he had left? You remember the peace proposal? It was a curious moment. Cartel leaders, including Jorge, offering to negotiate with the government. They would dismantle operations, turn themselves in, cooperate. In exchange, no extradition. The government hesitated. Publicly, they said it was an insult. Privately, they considered it, because Jorge's terms weren't just words. They were math. He laid out projections. How much the Colombian economy would regain by reintegrating cartel fortunes. How much violence would vanish if the war stopped. How much revenue the government could redirect toward rebuilding. He framed it as a business merger, and some officials listened. Escobar turned the offer into a performance. Radio interviews, newspaper op-eds, photographs in safe houses with gold-framed paintings. Jorge did none of that. His presence in the negotiations was felt, not seen. A government minister later recalled, "Whenever Jorge spoke, the room got still. Not out of fear, out of focus. You could sense that finally, someone in that world was treating the situation as solvable. Still, nothing came of it. Politics tightened. Fear overruled. And Jorge stepped back once more, but not before planting seeds. The idea of surrender was now on the table. He'd offered peace like a businessman closing a portfolio. Neatly, no emotion. And when it failed, he didn't rage. He recalculated. At home, Marta noticed a change. He started dressing more plainly. Started spending hours in the barn with the horses. He even resumed handwriting ledgers, a habit he had abandoned in favor of secure typing years ago. She asked him, "Why the old ways?" He answered, "Paper doesn't echo." And that, perhaps, is Jorge's core belief. Anything traceable is vulnerable, so he moves again. Not physically, but strategically. He decentralizes what's left of his operations, gives final control of several smuggling corridors to his most trusted lieutenants, on the condition that they never speak his name again. Not in meetings, not in letters, not even in code. He's not walking away. He's becoming a rumor. Even in the U.S., his file grows colder. Not because they've given up, but because they can't pin him. He's no longer moving funds, no longer signing papers. His assets are ghosts, his roots self-sustaining. An internal DEA report admits Ochoa's current involvement is undefined. The structure he created continues, but we have no evidence of direct oversight. That sentence is exactly what Jorge wants. You remember the charity gala? No press. Just 40 people in a colonial villa, raising money for post-conflict children's education. Jorge shows up in a gray suit. He gives a short speech, donates discreetly. No interviews, no photos. But the next day, a road repair project begins outside a rural school near a former lab site. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe he's still guiding the machine. Not from the driver's seat, but from the rearview mirror. Escobar's war begins to collapse inward. His sanctuaries fall. His allies vanish. The public, once torn, turns fully against him. U.S. Special Forces arrive. A new breed of Colombian soldier takes the fight to his doorstep. And Jorge? He starts to breathe again, not out of joy, out of completion. The structure he built is intact, even as the cartel itself melts into chaos. The system works without him. The phone doesn't ring, and when it does, it's never urgent. He begins planning an anniversary dinner. Nothing grand. Just Marta, the children, a few old friends, roasted lamb, soft music, a bottle of wine from that forgotten vineyard in Argentina. During the dinner, one guest leans in and says quietly, "You made it out, didn't you?" Jorge doesn't answer. He just lifts his glass, smiles, and says, "I'm still here," because he is. Not in power, not in hiding, but in equilibrium, and that's rarer than freedom. Later that night, as Marta washes dishes and the children argue over who spilled the wine, Jorge steps out to the porch. The night air is cool, silent, alive. He lights a cigarette, only half smokes it, lets it go out in the ashtray beside a book of poems he hasn't finished reading. There's a radio playing in the next room. Faint music. A woman's voice announcing the weather. Stable skies expected for the next few days. He listens, then closes his eyes and whispers to himself, let's hope they stay that way. Jorge Luis Ochoa stands at a crossroads, not the dramatic kind, with enemies closing in and helicopters circling overhead, but the quieter, more decisive kind. The kind you don't even recognize as a turning point until years later, sipping coffee, wondering how you ended up where no one can reach you. The year is 1990. Colombia is still bleeding, but the rhythm of the bloodshed has changed. The headlines scream Escobar, always Escobar, bombings in Bogota, police killed, journalists silenced. It's a tragedy soaked in diesel and gunpowder. And Jorge, he keeps riding his horses, because now the most dangerous thing he can do is anything at all. He's made himself still, and in a world this loud, stillness becomes camouflage. His name still lingers on a few lists. U.S. indictments remain active, but his presence faded. When agents try to trace transactions, they find empty corporate shells, dissolved months ago. When they dig into old properties, they find new owners, disconnected phone lines, ledgers that end mid-sentence. The system runs, but the architect has stepped behind the curtain. Mainstream historical fact. In 1990, President Cesar Gaviria launched the National Rehabilitation Plan, an effort to reassert state control over regions dominated by cartels. It was less about violence, more about presence, and Jorge, always watching for gaps, saw the change not as a threat, but as an opportunity. He begins to pivot. Again, no longer the financier, the logistics coordinator, the quiet calculator. Now he becomes the mediator. The government, desperate for stability, quietly reaches out to influential cartel figures. The goal isn't forgiveness, it's containment. Jorge is approached discreetly to discuss potential terms of surrender. He listens, doesn't commit, but he's interested. You remember the $1 million hostage? Back in the mid-'80s, Jorge's brother Fabio was kidnapped by guerrilla fighters. The ordeal ended without bloodshed, thanks to Jorge's careful negotiation. Money paid, favors pulled, calm kept. That reputation now circles back. Officials see him not just as a trafficker, but as a man who can negotiate with men who don't negotiate. So when they approach him with the idea of a framework for peace, Jorge doesn't flinch. He leans in. Meetings are held at ranches, embassies, back rooms of churches. He wears simple suits, speaks rarely. But when he does, the room quiets. Marta watches him come and go. His shirts are more rumpled now, his hair grayer, but his eyes? Still sharp as ledger ink. She asks him once, "Are you making a deal?" He replies, "I'm measuring the cost." And he is, because the price of freedom isn't just money, it's narrative. He knows that any surrender will become a symbol, a line in history books, the civilized kingpin, the businessman who turned himself in. He doesn't mind. He just wants to write the terms himself. So he drafts a proposal, not with lawyers, with numbers, how many years he's willing to serve, which assets can be seized, and which must remain untouched, what the headlines should say, what the records should not include. It's not a confession, it's an offer. One afternoon, he rides into the hills with an old friend, an ex-magistrate turned agricultural consultant. They sit beneath a jacaranda tree drinking lukewarm beer. The man says, "You think you can control the story?" Jorge replies, "Only the part that matters." And maybe that's enough, because weeks later the government responds. Not publicly, not officially, but with silence. The kind of silence that holds space for yes. At the hacienda, the mood lightens. The children visit more often. Marta hums again while tending the garden. Jorge eats slower, sleeps longer, but he still moves cautiously. He tightens security. Not more guards, just better ones. Old men with sharp eyes and soft voices. He changes his driver. He revises the list of people allowed to call after sunset. And then, the final meeting. It's held in a courthouse, of all places. Not a trial. Just a room with pale walls, tired fans, and men in suits too shiny for the heat. Jorge walks in with a folder. He sits, and he negotiates his own captivity. It's surreal. There are no guns, no shouting, just clauses, calendars, schedules. At one point, a young prosecutor leans in and says, "You're the first one we've spoken to who doesn't seem scared." Jorge replies, "I've been preparing for this since I stopped talking." A few days later, the press release goes out. Prominent figure in drug trade surrenders voluntarily. Details sealed. No photos, no spectacle. Just the sound of a door closing. Marta drives him to the prison herself. It's not a dungeon, not a fortress. More like a ranch that ran out of cattle. He's given a cell with a desk, a bed, and a window that opens just enough to let in the smell of eucalyptus. He unpacks 2 books, a radio, a leather-bound notebook. The guards treat him with respect, not out of fear, out of recognition. He's not their boss, but he's not their burden either. He settles into the routine, writes letters, drinks tea, watches the sun cross his window like an old friend on schedule. In this quiet, he begins reflecting, not on guilt or innocence, but on sequence, how one ledger became another, how silence grew into power, how power, when folded properly, becomes survival. Do you remember what he said that first night? To the guard as the door closed? "Thank you. If I snore, knock once." They both laughed, and then the light went out. Because for Jorge Luis Ochoa, the lights going out wasn't an end. It was part of the plan. Prison, for Jorge Luis Ochoa, is not a cage. It is an office with fewer distractions. From the outside, it looks like surrender. A headline, "A whispered victory for law and order." A photo of a government official shaking hands with no visible glee. But from the inside, it's just another managed transition, like swapping offices between departments of the same invisible corporation. Jorge doesn't enter as a criminal. He arrives as a planner on pause. The facility is rural, low security, technically a prison, but it smells more like a monastery. Concrete walls painted with half-hearted optimism, gardens out back, a few guards who moonlight as mechanics, or cooks, or quiet philosophers. Jorge quickly becomes a model inmate. He doesn't make demands, doesn't flinch at routine. He brings his own sheets, declines favors, offers advice sparingly but with weight. On his first morning, he sweeps his own cell. No one tells him to. He just knows. Control begins with floors. Mainstream historical fact. When members of the Medellín Cartel began surrendering in the early 1990s, they were often held in minimum security conditions, especially those who negotiated terms in advance. Reports of resort-style accommodations were common, though not without tension. Jorge's surrender was structured similarly, though his unit was notably quieter than Escobar's self-designed prison, La Catedral. Many people still think Jorge spent prison years in secret luxury. But so what do you think? Could a man who built empires out of patience really demand chandeliers where he only needed stillness? Inside, he builds a schedule. Mornings, correspondence. Afternoons, exercise. Evenings, letters and listening. The radio becomes his favorite possession. Classical music in the morning, political analysis in the afternoon, jazz at night when the guards grow drowsy. He writes letters, not to his old contacts, but to newspaper editors, scholars, and once, anonymously, to a radio host discussing the economics of organized networks. He signs nothing. He seals everything. He never mentions names. You remember the guard who played chess? A boy, really, 22, nervous, studious. Jorge watches him during rounds, eventually invites him for a game. They play every Thursday. After a month, the guard asks, "Did you ever regret it?" Jorge replies, "Only when someone got emotional during a business deal." The boy laughs, but Jorge doesn't, because regret for him isn't about morality. It's about inefficiency. At the hacienda, Marta keeps the routine alive. She visits once a week, brings fruit, books, photographs of the horses, updates about the garden. They talk, not about the past, not about what happens next, just the now. She tells him the roof needs fixing. He nods, mentions a good contractor. Never mind that he hasn't seen the man in 5 years. Jorge remembers everything. Inside, other inmates come and go. Some whisper about favors, about leverage, about old debts. Jorge listens, smiles, but never engages. He has nothing to prove. And that, oddly, gives him the most influence. A warden once said, "When he walks past, you feel like you're being evaluated," and you probably are, because Jorge keeps notes, not on people, on patterns. He observes how often the food truck arrives late, which guards smoke too close to the camera blind spots, what days the phones go down, always right before inspections. He's not planning escape. He's learning the new ecosystem, and that knowledge, even idle, keeps him calm. Then comes the first real test. An inmate arrives, young, loud, loyal to a different faction. He recognizes Jorge, sees only a quiet old man with thinning hair and clean fingernails. He starts muttering, then mocking, then challenging. One day, during lunch, he spills a tray by accident near Jorge's seat. Everyone freezes. Jorge doesn't flinch. He just lifts a napkin, wipes the bench, doesn't look up. The room holds its breath. The young man laughs, walks away. 3 days later, he's transferred without explanation. Jorge says nothing. But that afternoon, he spends extra time in the garden, pruning the rosemary bush the cook likes, because that's how influence works here. Not with retaliation, with removal of chaos. 1 month in, Jorge receives a letter. No return address, no signature, just one line. "You built the only system they couldn't kill." He doesn't reply, but he folds the letter and slips it inside a notebook titled Possible Futures. Inside, there are outlines, agricultural investments, international trade gaps, podcast trends. He finds them novel. Even a list of questions for a memoir he'll never write. He doesn't fantasize about returning to the business. He fantasizes about efficiency in exile, and strangely, that exile begins to feel like home. Do you remember the power outage? It lasts 12 hours. The cell block gets restless. No light, no hot meals, the radio's dead. But Jorge stays calm. He lights a candle, opens his window to let in air. Then he pulls out his notebook and begins sketching a water filtration design, just in case the next outage lasts longer. He doesn't expect anyone to ask for it. But if they do, he'll be ready, because Jorge Luis Ochoa has learned one truth most men never grasp. If you prepare the system well enough, it doesn't matter where you sit inside it. And tonight, as he watches shadows stretch across the wall, he knows he may never run the empire again, but it still runs through the corridors he built. Even if the world forgets his name, the balance sheet remembers. Time in prison doesn't pass in days, it passes in patterns. The soft clang of a gate opening at the same hour, the shuffle of the same footsteps down the same hallway, the quiet nods exchanged at predictable intervals. Jorge Luis Ochoa learns to read these patterns like music, subtle changes signaling larger shifts beneath the surface. By 1991, the world outside has shifted beyond recognition. Escobar is on the run, but not hiding. He's making noise from a custom-built prison where loyalty is enforced by proximity and paranoia. Colombia's government is under U.S. pressure more intense than ever. Political speeches begin to sound like war strategies. The line between cooperation and occupation blurs. But in Jorge's corner of the prison world, things remain almost eerily still. He's not forgotten, not quite, but he's become an institutional antique. Respected, observed, rarely disturbed. One morning, a new warden arrives. Younger, reform-minded, curious. He visits Jorge's cell personally. "You're the Ochoa?" Jorge smiles. "That's what the paperwork says." The warden lingers. Looks at the neatly arranged books, the folded blanket, the journal open to a half-sketched map of trade routes in West Africa. "You planning something?" he asks. Jorge gestures to the notebook. "Just imagining futures." The warden nods slowly. "Let me know if one of them includes breakfast getting better." Jorge chuckles. That night, he notes, new leadership, tolerant of irony, potential for improved dialogue. That's how his brain still works, even here. Marta visits more often now. They found a rhythm that resembles the one they had in their early days of marriage. Less business, more breathing. She brings him weather updates, clippings from the newspaper, some redacted with gentle strokes of pen, and homemade bread. She never asks, "When will you get out?" Instead, she asks, "Do you still feel like yourself?" And Jorge, without looking up from his tea, says, "More than ever. There's less noise here. Still." Beneath the stillness, the world is shifting in ways that matter. Mainstream historical fact. In 1991, Colombia adopted a new constitution, repealing the extradition of Colombian nationals to the United States. The decision, while controversial, effectively protected several high-profile figures, including Jorge, from facing trial abroad. Many people still think the repeal was purely political. But so what do you think? Could a constitutional clause really pass without input from men who understood how to move systems from behind curtains? The news comes to Jorge not through officials, but through Marta. She doesn't celebrate. She simply places the clipping on his desk and says, "Looks like you'll stay home after all." He nods, slow and measured. Then he places the article into a file labeled Thresholds. Because this wasn't escape. It was just another form of permanence. The prison now holds more new faces. Men who arrived too late, who weren't part of the earlier structure, who see Jorge as a relic rather than a player. But they watch him closely. Some with curiosity, some with envy. One approaches during rec time, asks him, "What was your secret?" Jorge doesn't answer right away. Then he says, "I always made sure my absence was harder to trace than my presence." It flies over the young man's head, but the guards nearby understand. "You remember the incident with the visiting journalist? She'd come to write a piece about reformed kingpins. Her tone was rehearsed, performative. She wanted confessions, quotes, a headline." Jorge met her in the visitation room. Wore the same suit he'd worn during his surrender, tailored but modest. She asked, "Do you regret your role in Colombia's pain?" He answered, "I regret the noise. The noise turned us all into caricatures." She blinked. He continued, "Some men built chaos. I built corridors. It's not the same thing." She never published the interview. Jorge suspected she couldn't decide whether he was honest or dangerous. And that ambiguity? Perfect. He returns to his routine, updates his notebooks. Gardens on Wednesdays. Sends coded notes to his attorneys about real estate portfolios tied to holding companies he hasn't controlled in a decade, but still watches, like old pets let loose in the hills. Even inside, he remains plugged in, not to people, to patterns. One day, a shipment of art supplies arrives at the prison, donated by a non-profit. Among the materials is a small crate of brushes labeled for community rehabilitation. Jorge notices a faint shipping code he recognizes, tied to a warehouse in Montevideo. He says nothing, but that night, he draws a straight line through a name in one of his older ledgers. The line is not revenge, it's retirement. Marta sees the change in him. They sit together one Sunday in the visitor's garden, the smell of cut grass and cheap soap mingling in the air. "You've already left," she says gently. He nods. There's just paperwork left to catch up, and she knows what he means. He's removed himself from everything except what will outlast him. That evening, he writes a letter, not to a lawyer or a contact, or even a family member, but to a man he once admired, long dead now. A quiet accountant from Bogota who taught him the value of margins and mistakes. The letter ends with, "If systems are maps, I only ever tried to be the compass." He seals it, then burns it, because not all records need archives. As he lies in bed that night, he stares at the ceiling fan spinning softly above him. It hums like a clock with no hands. He closes his eyes, not to sleep, but to imagine a world where silence was always the first move. Jorge Luis Ochoa wakes up to the same fan blade rhythm, the same filtered light through the cell bars, the same clink of a guard's boots down the corridor. But something in the air feels changed, not urgent, not dangerous, but seasonal. Like the first morning when the humidity breaks and autumn finally whispers its arrival. It's 1992 now. Escobar is out of his fortress prison, La Catedral, and back on the run. But it's not the same Escobar anymore. He's erratic, paranoid, setting traps for shadows. The world Jorge helped build is officially crumbling, and he isn't lifting a finger to stop it, because it's not his world anymore. That empire belonged to men who thought chaos was leverage. Jorge dealt in order, and order, in its own way, has rewarded him. The guards have grown used to his presence. They nod when he passes, ask about book recommendations, share mild complaints about the new kitchen contractor. He listens politely, files every name and complaint mentally, not to use, just to understand. Understanding is his last form of currency, mainstream historical fact. After Escobar's escape from La Catedral in mid-1992, Colombia's government, with increased U.S. backing, launched the Search Block, a militarized task force dedicated to hunting him down. It marked a turning point in cartel history, from dominance to dismantling. Many people still think Jorge feared the same fate. But so, what do you think? Could a man who handed in his sword before the war's climax really be afraid of a battlefield he designed to walk away from? One afternoon, a government official requests a visit. They meet in a side office away from common areas. The man wears a tired suit and speaks in quiet formality. He says, "We're revisiting sentences based on cooperative conduct." Jorge tilts his head, not surprised, not moved, just aware. He asks, "This is about the others, isn't it?" The man doesn't answer directly. Instead, he says, "There's a growing desire to close chapters, to file things away neatly." Jorge smiles faintly. That's always been the trick. He's not offered release, but he is offered exit pathways, conditional, supervised, invisible, the kind that allow the state to say, he served time, while letting the man walk into the shadows with his dignity folded neatly in a coat pocket. Marta arrives the next day. She's already heard the rumors. She brings a tin of dulce de leche and a look of quiet warning. "You know they'll expect a show." Jorge nods. "I've been practicing the right shade of humble," and he has. He prepares a short statement, not for the press, but for internal review. Just enough to suggest contrition without confession. He phrases it like a policy memo. "I accept that my decisions contributed to systems that became harmful." No more, no less. He gives it to the prison's internal committee, then returns to his cell and waters the basil plant he's been nurturing on the window ledge. The next few weeks pass like molasses. Nothing fast, but everything moving. You remember the call from the ministry? They didn't speak directly to Jorge. That's not how these things work. But the message trickled through. If he continued maintaining his current conduct, the review would recommend commutation, a fancy word for exit quietly, and that was fine, because Jorge never wanted triumph. He wanted conclusion. The day finally arrives wrapped in silence. No reporters, no ceremony. Just a folder, a signature, and a guard who looks both confused and oddly reverent. "You're being released," he says. Jorge nods. So they've decided the clock has ticked enough. He packs a small bag, 2 books, 1 pair of shoes, a stack of letters bound with twine. No farewell speech, just a final nod to the chess-playing guard. who fumbles with his radio and murmurs something about learning strategy. Jorge steps outside, and for the first time in years, the sun hits his face without filter. He breathes deeply. The scent of eucalyptus, concrete dust, and distant rain clouds. Marta waits in a modest car, not armored, not flashy. She doesn't exit the vehicle, just watches him walk toward her like it's another Wednesday. He gets in. They don't speak until they're 20 kilometers down the road. Then she says, "You're quiet." Jorge replies, "I'm just adjusting to the new volume." They return not to the old estate, but to a cottage near the coast. Smaller, tucked into green hills. No helipad, no guards. Just wind, trees, and the soft rustle of paper from the newspapers. Marta still insists on reading out loud every morning. You'd think he would feel restless, but he doesn't. He spends his days restoring an old library, cataloging, polishing, even writing annotations in pencil. Some pages he underlines, some he leaves blank, letting the silence speak for itself. He keeps a log of tides, a map of migrating birds, a ledger of quotes from letters never mailed. At night, he drinks chamomile tea, not scotch, not rum. And each night, he watches the coastline from a wicker chair, as if the ocean might return something it borrowed years ago. You remember the storm? It comes fast, rain slicing the sky, trees bent like apologies. Power flickers. Marta lights candles. Jorge, calm, finds the oil lamp he restored last spring. They sit together in the glow, not speaking. Outside, nature lashes at the windows like a prosecutor with thunder in his throat. But inside, stillness. Later, as the storm fades and the crickets return, Jorge opens his notebook to a fresh page. He writes, "Some storms pass through, others pass through you. Either way, the roof still stands." Then he closes the book, because some nights deserve no more words, just presence and a breath. The days roll on in a rhythm Jorge Luis Ochoa finds strangely comforting. Early sun through thin curtains, the occasional whistle of birds, the creak of wooden stairs softened by worn slippers. Each morning begins not with alarm clocks or coded messages, but with silence. And in that silence, Jorge finds the only thing he ever truly wanted: control without motion. He no longer receives visitors from his old life, not because they don't try, but because Jorge gently, systematically declines. There's no need to rehash the past. The past already knows its place in the filing cabinet. The cottage near the coast becomes its own little ecosystem. Marta tends the garden. Jorge writes, sometimes to no one in particular. Paragraphs on behavior, balance, the way shadows change shape depending on which hour you watch them. He starts keeping a journal titled "Structures That Survive Their Architects." In it, he explores the quiet phenomena of endurance, Roman aqueducts, faded blueprints, secret societies that outlive their creators, and occasionally, cartels that learn to function long after their designers stepped aside. Mainstream historical fact. By the early 1990s, the Medellín Cartel was effectively dismantled. The Cali Cartel rose in its place, taking a more businesslike, less violent approach, ironically echoing the very model Jorge had championed years earlier. Though he never joined them, many of their strategies carried his fingerprints. Many people still think Jorge resented being overshadowed by Escobar or replaced by Cali's methods. But so what do you think? Could a man who walked away before the orchestra fell apart really care about who took the last bow? One afternoon, Marta finds him staring at the horizon, a small notebook balanced on his knee, untouched for an hour. "You thinking of starting something again?" she teases. Jorge turns, half a smile in his eyes. "No. I'm thinking about how nice it is to not start." And it's true. For once he allows himself to be reactive. He reads novels, slowly, indulgently. He listens to international news in languages he doesn't speak, just to hear different cadences. He builds puzzles, sometimes only to take them apart and start over. You remember the boat? It wasn't even a real boat, just a small skiff, barely seaworthy, with a name faded into its hull. Noche Azul. Jorge buys it from a fisherman looking to retire. He doesn't take it out far, just coasts along the edge of the shore, watching the coastline pass like a postcard. Some afternoons he fishes. Most, he just floats. It becomes his quiet rebellion. No destination, no orders, no wait. At the cottage, life becomes miniature. He memorizes the squeak of every drawer, the exact amount of sugar Marta likes in her tea, the time the neighborhood cat tends to show up to claim a spot in the sun. He catalogs things, not because he needs to, because it's how he breathes. One day, a former associate sends a message, not directly, of course, but through a courier who leaves it tucked in a book at a local market Jorge hasn't visited in months. It's short, just 5 words. If needed again, would you? Jorge doesn't respond, but he leaves the book where it is. 2 weeks later, it's gone. And that's that. Because some questions don't need answers. They just need clarity of refusal. You remember the talk of a memoir? It started casually. A journalist, this one more respectful, asked to write his story. Promised to let the facts speak. To clarify the man from the myth. Jorge declined, not because he feared the story, but because the story was the weapon. And he had no use for weapons anymore. Still, that evening, he writes a letter he'll never send, a draft of what the opening line might have been. I never needed to disappear. I only needed to stop being expected. He folds it once, stores it inside his copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. Of course, he still reads that. The days continue their soft descent. Holidays pass without decoration. Birthdays marked by extra soup and long walks. Jorge watches a family of hawks nest in a tree beyond the garden. Tracks the fledglings as they grow and vanish one by one. Sometimes, late at night, he turns on the radio just to catch static. It reminds him of the old transmissions. Bursts of code pass through weather reports, scattered between frequencies. One night he hears a voice say, "The rain in Medellín fell harder today." No explanation. And he knows, instinctively, someone's sending a message, but not to him. And that, too, is a kind of peace. He closes the radio, steps out onto the porch. The moon is low, the tide quiet. Marta is already asleep. He sits with a blanket across his knees, watching the dark water rock gently against the rocks like it's trying to forget it ever held ships. He whispers something, not a prayer, just an acknowledgement of survival, of silence, of how very, very far he is from the center of anything, and yet how present he feels, here, now, at the edge of all former things. A year passes, and then another. The world continues its restless dance, but Jorge Luis Ochoa no longer hears the beat as loudly. In the quiet folds of his coastal retreat, the tempo has softened to the sound of distant waves, the crinkle of old maps, the click of pen to page. He doesn't count time in months. He counts it in harvests. The lemon tree yields more this season. The rosemary bush thickens. The small corner garden Marta cultivates now bursts with tomatoes she swears she didn't plant. They laugh about that. It's the kind of mystery Jorge can allow himself now. One that doesn't require solving or tracing or flagging for surveillance. He just eats the tomatoes. Each morning, his feet find the same spots on the creaky wood floors. The chair by the window. The table where he organizes clippings. The shelf with 3 well-thumbed volumes. Meditations, The Art of War, and Colombian Tax Reform, 1979 edition. He smiles when people ask what he reads. Things that remind me the system was never simple. Mainstream historical fact. By the mid-1990s, the last traces of the Medellín Cartel's original leadership were either dead, in hiding, or in prison. Jorge Luis Ochoa remained one of the few to walk away largely intact, having outmaneuvered both violence and vengeance by choosing precision over fire. Many people still think his freedom was a fluke, a bureaucratic oversight. But so what do you think? Could a man who once managed the logistics of an empire across continents really survive by accident? One afternoon, Jorge receives a letter, handwritten, no return address. The paper smells faintly of sea salt and cigar smoke. He opens it with steady fingers. Inside, just a single sentence. The river never forgets its original course. No signature, but he knows the handwriting. He sits with it for an hour, doesn't respond, doesn't destroy it. He simply slides it between the pages of a forgotten book on maritime shipping routes, where it will remain, waiting for no one in particular. That evening, he takes a walk, longer than usual, past the hills, beyond the abandoned train tracks, into the quiet where even the birds stop announcing their presence. He stands there breathing, hands behind his back like a man at a quiet museum. And maybe that's what this has all become. A collection of moments frozen in a gallery only he visits. The next day, Marta asks if he wants to travel. Maybe take a trip to Spain or Argentina. See something different. He says, why disturb the water if it's finally still? She doesn't press, because she knows. He's not hiding, he's settling, but not in defeat. In the slow, intentional way, one arranges memories across a room to remember without reopening wounds. You remember the child from the village? She'd drop by the garden sometimes, chasing a stray ball or looking for her runaway dog. One day, Jorge helps her tie her shoe. She asks what he does. He says, I used to count things. Now I just notice them. She nods, as if that makes perfect sense. Later, Marta tells him she saw the girl mimicking his slow walk near the road. She thinks you're some kind of monk. Jorge smirks. I'm just tired of sprinting. Still, the world doesn't forget him entirely. Occasionally, a name appears in the news. A distant cousin scandal. A politician caught with offshore accounts that somehow trace back to companies Jorge once ghost managed in the 1980s. But by the time investigators untangle the knots, the lines have faded. The signatures are erased. The assets dissolved and absorbed into legal entities that do nothing but exist. Even silence, it seems, compounds interest. One evening, rain begins to fall. Not violent, just steady. Jorge pulls on a sweater, lights the oil lamp, sits with a ledger he hasn't opened in years. Inside are lists, not of people or deals or shipments, just moments. The first time he smelled the inside of a Cessna. The sound of his brother's voice after release. The handshake from a man he never saw again but never forgot. The first time he chose to not pick up the phone. Moments, not money, because now, at the tail end of all empires, memory is the only vault that matters. He adds a final entry. Tonight the rain arrives without expectation. I let it. He closes the book. And with that, Jorge Luis Ochoa allows another night to fold over him like a blanket he no longer measures in weight, but in warmth. The kind of warmth you earn not by escaping history, but by surviving it gently. Sleep comes easier now. Not quickly, not all at once, but like fog curling into the corner of a quiet room. Jorge Luis Ochoa, once the architect of one of the most disciplined smuggling networks on Earth, now sleeps beside an open window. No alarms, no bodyguards, no doors propped with chairs. The only thing he keeps within reach is a notebook and a pencil worn down to a soft nub. Morning breaks soft and low. Marta reads aloud from the paper. Economic fluctuations in Bogota, new policy debates, the rising interest in decriminalization abroad. Jorge listens but doesn't comment. The world is catching up to ideas he once whispered into maps and sealed into offshore accounts. That afternoon, he receives a package, unmarked, no return label. Inside, a vintage briefcase, worn leather, the clasp still stiff. He recognizes it instantly. He left it behind in 1984 during a rushed meeting with officials posing as intermediaries. It had disappeared, presumed seized. Yet, here it was, returned like a memory with no demand. He doesn't open it immediately. He lets it sit in the hallway like a guest, deciding whether it still belongs. Mainstream historical fact. As the 1990s closed, Colombia's government formally acknowledged the complexity of cartel-era negotiations, some involving unwritten deals, unspoken understandings, and quietly erased debts. Much of what happened behind closed doors was never entered into official record. Many people still think that silence was corruption. But so what do you think? Could there be a difference between moral compromise and structural triage? That evening, Jorge opens the case. Inside, a faded notebook with only half a page written, a rusted key with no tag, an envelope of pesos, worthless now, and a photograph. His father at the original ranch, hat tipped low, face unreadable. He studies the photo for a long time. That's the part most people never understood. He wasn't born into power. He was born into expectation. And expectation is a quiet weight that never leaves. You remember the story of his father's saddle? It had been handcrafted by a local artisan. Simple but precise. Every stitch intentional. Jorge kept it long after the horse was gone. Not out of sentiment, but as a study in construction. What lasts, what holds. He finds the saddle one day while clearing out the shed. Dusty, cracked, but intact. He oils the leather, repairs a torn strap, hangs it above the workbench. Not as a trophy, but a reminder. Build with hands steady enough that absence doesn't collapse the frame. That becomes his philosophy in these final years. He starts writing a manual, not for smugglers, not for family, but for no one. It's titled On Maintenance. The chapters aren't numbered, just phrases. Know when systems expire. Don't teach all the way. Silence is a pressure valve, not a wall. He never intends to publish. It's the act of writing that keeps his spine upright. Marta, ever observant, watches him shrink into thought more often. She doesn't interrupt, doesn't ask. She simply starts cooking heavier soups, placing his favorite chair closer to the fireplace and reminding him gently when the birds are nesting. They live in the soft margins of memory now. One morning, Jorge watches fog roll across the field and imagines what it would look like if time had color. He thinks, maybe it's not gray, maybe it's just earned. The neighbors treat him as an eccentric, which suits him. They wave politely, ask about the weather, occasionally bring over honey or cheese. No one asks questions. The village has developed a kind of respectful forgetfulness about his past, and Jorge encourages that, because clarity can be exhausting. You remember the firefly night? It happened just once. A warm spring evening when the hillside glowed like a sky flipped upside down. Jorge sat outside for hours, silent, watching them flicker. When Marta finally coaxed him inside, he said, "They don't ask where they're going. They just light what they can." And that perhaps is his final form of leadership. Not direction, just illumination. Later, he begins organizing his papers, not to share, but to leave clean trails. He shreds the irrelevant, tags the meaningful. He writes a note for Marta. "Don't explain me, just keep the lemons watered." She finds it tucked in a book on risk modeling, and she smiles, because she won't explain him. She never did. That night, Jorge watches the stars like their account ledgers. He traces constellations with his finger, mapping transactions no one else sees. And somewhere between Orion and the Southern Cross, he forgives himself, not with grand declarations or final confessions, just a breath and a page turned over. There's a sound Jorge Luis Ochoa has come to recognize not by tone but by feeling, like a shift in atmospheric pressure. It's the sound of something ending quietly. It happens one morning in late summer. The breeze has changed. The salt hangs differently in the air. Even the crows seem to land more softly on the fence posts. Jorge notices it all. He stands by the window longer than usual, teacup warm in his hand. Marta's quiet footsteps humming behind him like the final notes of a lullaby. She asks if he wants to visit the sea today. He doesn't answer right away. Instead, he says, "I'd like to walk as far as the fence. That's enough travel for today." They walk slowly, hand in hand. Each step less about direction, more about memory. Revisiting places that never made it into newspaper headlines or court files. The bend in the path where Marta once found a fox curled in the grass. The oak tree that dropped its acorns like marbles on the patio for 3 months straight. The bench that creaks like an old violin, but still holds firm. That afternoon, Jorge begins sorting through the last of his notebooks. Not the ledgers, not the coded pages, just the journals he kept after his surrender. The ones filled with things like cloud shapes, odd dreams, and quotes from grocery receipts that struck him as philosophical. He places most of them in a wooden box labeled Echoes, mainstream historical fact. In the years following Jorge's release, Colombian politics underwent massive shifts. Peace talks with guerrilla groups, new trade pacts, and gradual moves toward drug decriminalization. The world Jorge once shaped had evolved into something more diplomatic, more public-facing, less reliant on shadows. Many people still think he was irrelevant by the end. But so what do you think? Is legacy measured in headlines, or in the fact that the systems you built continue long after you've let go of the wheel? That evening, he watches the sunset the way some men watch courtroom verdicts. Calm, expectant, aware of consequences unseen. He remembers one of his last nights in prison, pacing the corridor in bare feet because the silence was too loud. A younger inmate had asked him what the real risk had been. Was it the Americans, the cartels, the law? Jorge had paused, then said, "It was believing I had more time than I did." The young man hadn't understood then. He might now. Later, Marta finds Jorge seated on the patio, a blanket across his knees, one of the old maps folded in his lap. She brings tea and says nothing. He looks at her, smiling softly. "I think I'm done," he says. She nods. "Then rest." And he does, but not like before. This time it's not recovery. It's surrender, but not the kind people fear. It's the kind that comes when you've run out of wars and discover you were only ever fighting the mirror. You remember the night they burned the last of the papers? A windless, cloudless evening. Jorge didn't speak. He just watched page after page curl into ash. Documents no longer needed. Names long dead. Patterns that had fulfilled their purpose. He said, "Now no one has to keep secrets they never asked to hold." Marta kissed his forehead, and they returned inside, smelling faintly of smoke and closure. Weeks later, Jorge begins moving more slowly. His walks shorten. His naps lengthen. The lemon tree blooms, and he no longer rises early to inspect it. He trusts the roots. One morning, he doesn't come to breakfast. Marta finds him in his chair, not quite asleep, not quite awake, his notebook resting open on the final page. No writing, just a pencil line drawn cleanly across the paper, horizontal, soft, deliberate, as if to say, this was enough. She doesn't cry right away. She just sits beside him, takes his hand, and watches the tide pull out. Because some men live like storms, but Jorge, he lived like architecture. And when it was time, he didn't collapse. He simply let go. The house near the coast remains. Wind kisses its eaves gently, as if acknowledging a presence that once gave it shape. The garden Marta keeps continues to bloom in small, resilient bursts. Lemons, rosemary, the wild tomatoes that still sprout without instruction. Time, when it moves through this place now, feels less like a forward march and more like an echo bouncing back from soft hills. Jorge Luis Ochoa is gone, but not vanished. His notebooks remain, bound and tucked into shelves with labels written in his even hand. Echoes, structures, margins. Marta has not moved a single one. She dusts them weekly, not to preserve, just to acknowledge. The village doesn't say much. They never really did. A few neighbors offer condolences and murmurs, but mostly they show respect by staying silent. One leaves flowers near the bench by the fig tree. Another brings a loaf of bread without note. A child carves a small bird into the wooden gate because she says he always nodded at the crows. Marta smiles at that. Mainstream historical fact. After Jorge's death, there was no major media storm. A few outlets ran obituaries. Most focused on the Medellín years, his role in the early logistics, his surrender, the years he avoided American extradition. But none seemed to know how to end the story properly. Many people still think the quietness of his passing meant his legacy had faded. But so what do you think? Can a man who designed silence as strategy really be mourned in headlines? Marta writes no memoir. She grants no interviews. When asked about him, she says he preferred paper to microphones, and that's the last anyone presses. At night, the house feels different. Not emptier, just redistributed. Jorge's presence doesn't linger as a ghost. It lingers as balance, a steady rhythm in how the doors swing closed, how the pantry is still organized by expiration date, how the wind never rattles the shutters the way it used to. She finds one final note months later, tucked between two books on irrigation systems. It says, "If this is ever read, tell no one how it ends. Tell them it quieted. That's enough." And so she does. She donates most of the books to a nearby school, anonymously. She keeps 3, The Count of Monte Cristo, on maintenance, and one unlabeled journal filled with phrases that sound more like breath than statements. One entry reads, "Stillness doesn't mean absence. It means nothing is being asked of you right now." She copies that onto a scrap of wood and nails it to the garden gate. Visitors assume it's poetry. She doesn't correct them. You remember the storm that followed? Heavy wind, sudden rain, the kind of coastal tantrum that makes power flicker and cats vanish. But the house stood firm. The garden held. The saddle stayed on its hook. And afterward, the air smelled like lemon and old paper. Some say a legacy is what you leave behind. But for Jorge Luis Ochoa, legacy was never about monument or myth. It was about what remained standing without needing his name to explain it. The systems he built? Gone. The enemies? Dust. The empire? Dismantled. But the quiet stayed. And in that quiet, maybe someone else learns. You don't need to be feared to survive. You don't need to be famous to be remembered. And you don't need to be perfect to leave no debris behind. Jorge's story ends, not with exile or execution, but with peace carved from the noise he once helped create. Because sometimes the sharpest minds don't go out in flames. They fade, deliberately, until all that's left is a whisper in the trees and the calm rhythm of waves where nothing explodes, only ebbs. And in the end, that was always the goal. So now, as the story settles into the stillness it's earned, let's slow down together. Take one last breath in this world of shadowed maps, ledgers etched in code, and footsteps that left no echo. Let the tension melt from your shoulders. Let your jaw unclench. Feel how the silence Jorge cherished wasn't emptiness. It was intention. He didn't vanish. He withdrew. And in that retreat, he found something many men never do. A place where nothing needed fixing, earning, or hiding. The sea still moves just as it always has. The birds still perch in their silent congress. The pages in his journal stopped turning not because they were full, but because the message was complete. Close your eyes. Imagine that cottage by the coast. Lemons heavy on the branch, breeze sighing against the shutters, and somewhere, a kettle whispering that everything is exactly where it needs to be. There are no sirens now, no calls to make, no meetings or debts or headlines, just the quiet tap of wind across an old chair on the porch, and the knowledge that legacies don't have to roar. They can if done just right, rest, and so can you. Good night.